Section 26 of an essay concerning Human Understanding, Book 2, by John Locke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary B. Clayton. Chapter 27, Footnote. Locke discusses the Bishop of Worcester, Part 2. The well-known tree in Epping Forest, called the King's Oak, which from not weighing an ounce at first, grew to have many tons of timber in it, was all along the same oak, the very same plant. But nobody, I think, will say that it was the same body when it weighed a ton, as it was when it weighed but an ounce, unless he has a mind to signalize himself by saying that that is the same body which has 1,000 particles of different matter in it, for one particle that is the same. Which is no better than to say that 1,000 different particles are but one and the same particle, and one and the same particle is 1,000 different particles, 1,000 times a greater absurdity than to say half is whole, or the whole is the same with the half, which will be improved 10,000 times yet farther, if a man shall say, as your lordship seems to me to argue here, that that great oak is the very same body with the acorn it sprang from, because there was in that acorn an oak in little, which was afterwards, as your lordship expresses it, so much enlarged as to make that mighty tree. For this embryo, if I may so call it, or oak in little, being not the 100th, or perhaps the 1,000th part of the acorn, and the acorn being not the 1,000th part of the grown oak, it will be very extraordinary to prove the acorn and the grown oak to be the same body, by a way wherein it cannot be pretended that above one particle of 100,000 or 1,000,000 is the same in the one body that it was in the other. From which way of reasoning it will follow that a nurse and her suckling child have the same body, and be past doubt that a mother and her infant have the same body. But this is a way of certainty found out to establish the articles of faith, and to overturn the new method of certainty that your lordship says, quote, I have started, which is apt to leave men's minds more doubtful than before, end quote. And now I desire your lordship to consider of what use it is to you in the present case, to quote out of my essay these words, quote, that partaking of one common life makes the identity of a plant, end quote, since the question is not about the identity of a plant, but about the identity of a body, it being a very different thing to be the same plant and to be the same body. For that which makes the same plant does not make the same body, the one being the partaking in the same continued vegetable life, the other the consisting of the same numerical particles of matter. And therefore your lordship's inference from my words above quoted in these which you subjoin seems to me a very strange one, viz., quote, so that in things capable of any sort of life, the identity is consistent with a continued succession of parts, and so the wheat grown up is the same body with the grain that was sown, end quote. For I believe if my words from which you infer, quote, and so the wheat grown up is the same body with the grain that was sown, end quote, were put into a syllogism, this would hardly be brought to be the conclusion. But your lordship goes on with consequence upon consequence, though I have not eyes acute enough everywhere to see the connection, till you bring it to the resurrection of the same body. The connection of your lordship's words is as followeth, quote, and thus the alteration of the parts of the body at the resurrection is consistent with its identity, if its organization and life be the same, and this is a real identity of the body, which depends not upon consciousness. From whence it follows that to make the same body no more is required, but restoring life to the organized parts of it, end quote. If the question were about raising the same plant, I do not say but there might be some appearance for making such an inference from my words as this, quote, whence it follows, and that to make the same plant no more is required, but to restore life to the organized parts of it, end quote. But this deduction wherein, from those words of mine that speak only of the identity of a plant, your lordship infers there is no more required to make the same body than to make the same plant. Being too subtle for me, I leave to my reader to find out. Your lordship goes on and says that I grant likewise, quote, that the identity of the same man consists in a participation of the same continued life by constantly fleeting particles of matter in succession, vitally united to the same organized body, end quote. Answer. I speak in these words of the identity of the same man, and your lordship thence roundly concludes, quote, so that there is no difficulty of the sameness of the body, end quote. But your lordship knows that I do not take these two sounds, man and body, to stand for the same thing, nor the identity of the man to be the same with the identity of the body. But let us read out your lordship's words, quote, so that there is no difficulty as to the sameness of the body, if life were continued, and if by divine power life be restored to that material substance which was before united by a reunion of the soul to it, there is no reason to deny the identity of the body, not from the consciousness of the soul, but from that life which is the result of the union of the soul and the body, end quote. If I understand your lordship right, you in these words from the passages above quoted out of my book argue that from those words of mine it will follow that it is or may be the same body that is raised at the resurrection. If so, my lord, your lordship has then proved that my book is not inconsistent with, but conformable to this article of the resurrection of the same body, which your lordship contends for, and will have to be an article of faith. For though I do by no means deny that the same bodies shall be raised at the last day, yet I see nothing your lordship has said to prove it to be an article of faith. But your lordship goes on with your proofs and says, quote, but St. Paul still supposes that it must be that material substance to which the soul was before united. For, saith he, quote, it is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption, it is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory, it is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body, end quote. Can such a material substance, which was never united to the body, be sown in corruption, and weakness, and dishonor? Either, therefore, he must speak of the same body, or his meaning cannot be comprehended, end quote. I answer, quote, can such a material substance, which was never laid in a grave, be said to be sown, etc.? For your lordship says, quote, you do not say the same individual particles which were united at the point of death shall be raised at the last day, end quote, and no other particles are laid in the grave but such as are united at the point of death. Either, therefore, your lordship must speak of another body, different from that which was sown, which shall be raised, or else your meaning, I think, cannot be comprehended. But whatever your meaning, your lordship proves it to be St. Paul's meaning, that the same body shall be raised which was sown, in these following words, quote, for what does all this relate to a conscious principle, end quote? Answer. The scripture being express, that the same person should be raised and appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive according to what he had done in his body. It was very well suited to common apprehensions, which refined not about, quote, particles that had been vitally united to the soul, end quote, to speak of the body which each one was to have after the resurrection, as he would be apt to speak of it himself. For it being his body both before and after the resurrection, every one ordinarily speaks of his body as the same, though in a strict and philosophical sense, as your lordship speaks, it be not the very same. Thus it is no impropriety of speech to say, quote, this body of mine, which was formerly strong and plump, is now weak and wasted, end of quote. Though in such a sense as you are speaking here, it be not the same body. Revelation declares nothing anywhere concerning the same body in your lordship's sense of the same body, which appears not to have been thought of. The apostle directly proposes nothing for or against the same body as necessary to be believed. That which he is plain and direct in is his opposing and condemning such curious questions about the body, which could serve only to perplex, not to confirm what was material and necessary for them to believe, viz., a day of judgment and retribution to men in a future state, and therefore it is no wonder that, mentioning their bodies, he should use a way of speaking suited to vulgar notions, from which it would be hard positively to conclude anything for the determining of this question, especially against expressions in the same discourse that plainly incline to the other side, in a matter which, as it appears, the apostle thought not necessary to determine, and the Spirit of God thought not fit to gratify any one's curiosity in. But your lordship says, quote, "The apostle speaks plainly of that body which was once quickened, and afterwards falls to corruption, and is to be restored with more noble qualities. I wish your lordship had quoted the words of St. Paul, wherein he speaks plainly of that numerical body that was once quickened. They would presently decide this question. But your lordship proves it by these following words of St. Paul, quote, 'For this corruption must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality,' end quote, to which your lordship adds, quote, 'that you do not see how he could more expressly affirm the identity of this corruptible body with that after the resurrection,' end quote. How expressly it is affirmed by the apostle shall be considered by and by. In the meantime, it is past doubt that your lordship best knows what you do or do not see. But this I would be bold to say, that if St. Paul had anywhere in this chapter, where there are so many occasions for it, if it had been necessary to have been believed, but said in express words that the same body should be raised, everyone else who thinks of it will see he had more expressly affirmed the identity of the bodies which men now have with those they shall have after the resurrection. The remainder of your lordship's period is, quote, 'and that without any respect to the principle of self-consciousness,' end quote. Answer. In these words I doubt not have some meaning, but I must own I know not what, either towards the proof of the resurrection of the same body, or to show that anything I have said concerning self-consciousness is inconsistent, for I do not remember that I have anywhere said that the identity of body consisted in self-consciousness. From your preceding words, your worship concludes thus, quote, 'And so if the Scripture be the sole foundation of our faith, this is an article of it,' end quote. My lord, to make the conclusion unquestionable, I humbly conceive the words must run thus, quote, 'And so if the Scripture and your lordship's interpretation of it be the sole foundation of our faith, the resurrection of the same body is an article of it,' end quote. For with submission, your lordship has neither produced express words of Scripture for it, nor so proved that to be the meaning of any of those words of Scripture which you have produced for it, that a man who reads and sincerely endeavors to understand the Scripture cannot but find himself obliged to believe, as expressly, quote, 'that the same bodies of the dead,' end quote, in your lordship's sense, shall be raised as, quote, 'that the dead shall be raised,' end quote. And I crave leave to give your lordship this one reason for it. He who reads with attention this discourse of St. Paul, where he discourses of the resurrection, will see that he plainly distinguishes between the dead that shall be raised and the bodies of the dead. For it is. Some untranslated Greek words. Are the nominative cases too? Some untranslated Greek words. All along, and not. Some untranslated Greek words. Bodies, which one may with reason think would be somewhere or other have been expressed, if all this had been said to purpose it as an article of faith, that the very same body should be raised. The same manner of speaking the Spirit of God observes all through the New Testament, where it is said, quote, 'Raise the dead, quicken or make alive the dead, the resurrection of the dead,' end quote. Nay, these very words of our Saviour, urged by your lordship for the resurrection of the same body, run thus. Some untranslated Greek words. Would not a well-meaning searcher of the Scriptures be apt to think that if the thing here intended by our Saviour were to teach and propose it as an article of faith, necessary to be believed by everyone, that the very same bodies of the dead should be raised, Would not, I say, any one be apt to think that if our Savior meant so, the word should rather have been a few untranslated Greek words, i.e., all the bodies that are in the graves, rather than, all who are in the graves, which must denote persons and not precisely bodies? Another evidence that St. Paul makes a distinction between the dead and the bodies of the dead, so that the dead cannot be taken in this. 1 Corinthians 15, to stand precisely for the bodies of the dead, are these words of the apostle, But some men will say, How are the dead raised? And with what bodies do they come? Which words? Dead? And they? If supposed to stand precisely for the bodies of the dead, the question will run thus, How are the dead bodies raised? And with what bodies do the dead bodies come? Which seems to have no very agreeable sense. This therefore being so, that the Spirit of God keeps so expressly to this phrase, or form of speaking in the New Testament, of raising, quickening, rising, resurrection, etc., of the dead, where the resurrection of the last day is spoken of, and that the body is not mentioned, but in answer to this question, with what bodies shall those dead who are raised come? So that by the dead cannot precisely be meant the dead bodies. I do not see but a good Christian, who reads the Scripture with an intention to believe all that is there revealed to him concerning the resurrection, may acquit himself of his duty therein, without entering into the inquiry, whether the dead shall have the very same bodies or no. Which sort of inquiry the apostle, by the appellation he bestows here on him that makes it, seems not much to encourage. Nor, if he shall think himself bound to determine concerning the identity of the bodies of the dead raised at the last day, will he, by the remainder of St. Paul's answer, find the determination of the apostle to be much in favor of the very same body, unless the being told that the body sown is not that body that shall be, that the body raised is as different from that which was laid down as the flesh of man is from the flesh of beasts, fishes, and birds, or as the sun, moon, and stars are different one from another, or as different as a corruptible, weak, natural, mortal body is from an incorruptible, powerful, spiritual, immortal body, and lastly, as different as a body that is flesh and blood is from a body that is not flesh and blood. For flesh and blood cannot, says St. Paul, in this very place, inherit the kingdom of God, unless, I say, all this, which is contained in St. Paul's words, can be supposed to be the way to deliver this as an article of faith, which is required to be believed by everyone, viz., that the dead should be raised with the very same bodies that they had before in this life, which article proposed in these or the like plain and express words could have left no room for doubt in the meanest capacities, nor for contest in the most perverse minds. Your Lordship adds in the next words, And so it hath been always understood by the Christian Church, viz., that the resurrection of the same body in your Lordship's sense of the same body is an article of faith. Answer. What the Christian Church has always understood is beyond my knowledge, but for those who, coming short of your Lordship's great learning, cannot gather their articles of faith from the understanding of all the whole Christian Church, ever since the preaching of the Gospels, who make the far greater part of Christians, I think I may say 999 of 1,000, but are forced to have recourse to the Scripture to find them there, I do not see that they will easily find there this proposed as an article of faith, that there shall be a resurrection of the same body, but that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, without explicitly determining that they shall be raised up with bodies made up wholly of the same particles which were once vitally united to their souls in their former life, without the mixture of any one other particle of matter, which is that which your Lordship means by the same body. But supposing your Lordship to have demonstrated this to be an article of faith, though I crave leave to own that I do not see, that all that your lordship has said here makes it so much as probable. What is all this to me? Yes, says your lordship in the following words, quote, my idea of personal identity is inconsistent with it, for it makes the same body which was here united to the soul, not to be necessary to the doctrine of the resurrection. But any material substance united to the same principle of consciousness makes the same body. End quote. This is an argument of your lordship's which I am obliged to answer to. But is it not fit I should first understand it before I answer it? Now here I do not well know what it is, quote, to make a thing not to be necessary to the doctrine of the resurrection, end quote. But to help myself out the best I can, with a guess, I will conjecture, which, in disputing with learned men, is not very safe, your lordship's meaning is that, quote, my idea of personal identity makes it not necessary, end quote, that for the raising the same person, the body should be the same. Your lordship's next word is, quote, but, end quote, to which I am ready to reply, but what? What does my idea of personal identity do? For something of that kind, the adversative or particle, quote, but, end quote, should, in the ordinary construction of our language, introduce to make the proposition clear and intelligible, but here is no such thing. But is one of your lordship's privileged particles, which I must not meddle with, for fear your lordship complain of me again, quote, as so severe a critic that for the least ambiguity in any particle fill up pages in my answer to make my book look considerable for the bulk of it, end quote. But since this proposition here, quote, my idea of personal identity makes the same body which was here united to the soul, not necessary to the doctrine of the resurrection, but any material substance being united to the same principle of consciousness makes the same body, end quote, is brought to prove my idea of personal identity inconsistent with the article of the resurrection. I must make it out in some direct sense or other, that I may see whether it be both true and conclusive. Therefore venture to read it thus, quote, my idea of personal identity makes the same body which was here united to the soul not to be necessary at the resurrection, but allows that any material substance being united to the same principle of consciousness makes the same body. Ergo, my idea of personal identity is inconsistent with the article of the resurrection of the same body. End quote. If this be your lordship's sense in this passage, as I here have guessed it to be, or else I know not what it is, I answer, 1. That my idea of personal identity does not allow that any material substance being united to the same principle of consciousness makes the same body. I say no such thing in my book, nor anything from whence it may be inferred, and your lordship would have done me a favor to have set down the words where I say so, or those from which you infer so, and show how it follows from anything I have said. 2. Granting that it were a consequence from my idea of personal identity, that any material substance being united to the same principle of consciousness makes the same body, end quote, this would not prove that my idea of personal identity was inconsistent with this proposition, quote, that the same body shall be raised, end quote, but, on the contrary, affirms it, since if affirm as I do that the same person shall be raised, and it be a consequence of my idea of personal identity that, quote, any material substance being united to the same principle of consciousness makes the same body, end quote, follows that if the same person be raised, the same body must be raised, and so I have herein not only said nothing inconsistent with the resurrection of the same body, but have said more for it than your lordship. For there can be nothing plainer than that in the Scripture it is revealed that the same person shall be raised and appear before the judgment seat of Christ, to answer for what they have done in their bodies. If therefore whatever matter be joined to the same principle of consciousness makes the same body, it is demonstration that if the same persons are raised, they have the same bodies. How then your lordship makes this an inconsistency with the resurrection is beyond my conception. Yes, says your lordship, quote, it is inconsistent with it, for it makes the same body which was here united to the soul not to be necessary, end quote. 3. I answer therefore thirdly, that this is the first time I ever learnt that not necessary was the same with inconsistent. I say that a body made up of the same numerical parts of matter is not necessary to the making of the same person, from whence it will indeed follow that to the resurrection of the same person the same numerical particles of matter are not required. What does your lordship infer from hence, to wit, this? Therefore he who thinks that the same particles of matter are not necessary to the making of the same person cannot believe that the same person shall be raised with bodies made of the very same particles of matter, if God should reveal that it shall be so, viz., that the same person shall be raised with the same bodies they had before. Which is all one as to say, that he who thought the blowing of ram's horns was not necessary in itself to the falling down of the walls of Jericho, could not believe that they should fall upon the blowing of ram's horns, when God had declared it should be so. Your lordship says, quote, my idea of personal identity is inconsistent with the article of the resurrection, end quote. The reason you ground it on is this, because it makes not the same body necessary to the making the same person. Let us grant your lordship's consequence to be good. What will follow from it? No less than this, that your lordship's notion, for I dare not say that your lordship has any so dangerous things as ideas, of personal identity is inconsistent with the article of the resurrection. The demonstration of it is thus. Your lordship says, quote, it is not necessary that the body to be raised at the last day should consist of the same particles of matter which were united at the point of death, for there must be a great alteration in them in a lingering disease, as if a fat man falls into a consumption. You do not say the same particles which the sinner had at the very time of commission of his sins, for then a long sinner must have a vast body, considering the continual spending of particles by perspiration. End quote. And again, here your lordship says, quote, you allow the notion of personal identity to belong to the same man under several change of matter, end quote. From which words it is evident that your lordship supposes a person in this world may be continued and preserved the same in a body, not consisting of the same individual particles of matter, and hence it demonstratively follows that let your lordship's notion of personal identity be what it will, it makes, quote, the same body not to be necessary to the same person, end quote, and therefore it is by your lordship's rule inconsistent with the article of the resurrection. When your lordship shall think fit to clear your own notion of personal identity from this inconsistency with the article of the resurrection, I do not doubt but my idea of personal identity will be therefore cleared too. Till then, all inconsistency with that article which your lordship has here charged on mine will unavoidably fall upon your lordship's too. But for the clearing of both, give me leave to say, my lord, that whatsoever is not necessary does not thereby become inconsistent. It is not necessary to the same person that his body should always consist of the same numerical particles. This is demonstration, because the particles of the bodies of the same persons in this life change every moment, and your lordship cannot deny it. And yet this makes it not inconsistent with God's preserving, if he thinks fit, to the same persons bodies consisting of the same numerical particles always from the resurrection to eternity. And so likewise, though I say anything that supposes it not necessary that the same numerical particles which were vitally united to the soul in this life should be reunited to it at the resurrection, and constitute the body it shall then have, yet it is not inconsistent with this that God may, if he pleases, give to everyone a body consisting only of such particles as were before vitally united to his soul. And thus, I think, I have cleared my book from all that inconsistency which your lordship charges on it, and would persuade the world it has with the article of the resurrection of the dead. Only before I leave it, I will set down the remainder of what your lordship says upon this head, that though I see not the coherence nor tendency of it, nor the force of any argument in it against me, yet that nothing may be omitted that your lordship has thought fit to entertain your reader with on in this new point, nor any one have reason to suspect that I have passed by any word of your lordship's on this now first introduced subject. wherein he might find your lordship had proved what you had promised in your title page. Your remaining words are these, quote, "The dispute is not how far personal identity in itself may consist in the very same material substance, for we allow the notion of personal identity to belong to the same man under several changes of matter, but whether it doth not depend upon a vital union between the soul and body, and the life which is consequent upon it. And therefore in the resurrection the same material substance must be reunited, or else it cannot be called a resurrection, but a renovation, i.e., it may be a new life, but not a raising the body from the dead. I confess I do not see how what is here ushered in by the words, quote, and therefore, end quote, is a consequence from the preceding words, but as to the propriety of the name, I think it will not be much questioned that if the same man rise who was dead, it may very properly be called the resurrection of the dead, which is the language of the Scripture. I must not part with this article of the resurrection without returning my thanks to your lordship for making me take notice of a fault in my essay. When I wrote that book, I took it for granted, as I doubt not but many others have done, that the Scripture had mentioned in express terms, quote, the resurrection of the body, end quote. But upon the occasion your lordship has given me in your last letter to look a little more narrowly into what Revelation has declared concerning the resurrection, and finding no such express words in the Scripture as that, quote, the body shall rise or be raised, or the resurrection of the body, end quote. I shall in the next edition of it change these words of my book, quote, the dead bodies of men shall rise, end quote, into these of the Scripture, quote, the dead shall rise, end quote. Not that I question that the dead shall be raised with bodies, but in matters of revelation, I think it not only safest, but our duty, as far as anyone delivers it for revelation, to keep close to the words of the Scripture, unless he will assume himself the authority of one inspired, or make himself wiser than the Holy Spirit himself. If I had spoke of the resurrection in precisely Scripture terms, I had avoided giving your lordship the occasion of making here such a verbal reflection on my words, quote, what? Not if there be an idea of identity as to the body? End quote. End of section 26. Recording by Gary B. Clayton.
Section 27 of An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Book 2 by John Locke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 28 of Moral Relations. 1. Besides the before-mentioned occasions of time, place, and causality, of comparing or referring things to one another, there are, as I have said, infinite others, some whereof I shall mention. First, the first I shall name is some one simple idea, which being capable of parts or degrees accords an occasion of comparing the subjects wherein it is to one another, in respect to that simple idea, v.g. whiter, sweeter, equal, more, etc. These relations, depending on the equality and excess of the same simple idea, in several subjects, may be called, if one will, proportional, and that these are only conversant about those simple ideas received from sensation or reflection, it is so evident that nothing need be said to evince it. 2. Secondly, another occasion of comparing things together or considering one thing so as to include in that consideration some other thing is the circumstance of their origin or beginning, which being not afterwards to be altered, make the relations depending thereon as lasting as the subjects to which they belong, v.g. father and son, brothers, cousin germans, etc., which have their relations by one community of blood, wherein they partake in several degrees, countrymen, i.e. those who were born in the same country or tract of ground, and these I call natural relations, wherein we may observe that mankind have fitted their notions and words to the use of common life and not to the truth and extent of things. For it is certain that in reality the relation is the same betwixt the begetter and the begotten, in the several races of other animals as well as men. But yet it is seldom said, this bull is the grandfather of such a calf, or that 2 pigeons are cousin germans. It is very convenient that by distinct names these relations should be observed and marked out in mankind, there being occasion both in laws and other communications one with another to mention and take notice of men under these relations, from whence also arise the obligations of several duties amongst men. Whereas in brutes, men having very little or no cause to mind these relations, they have not thought fit to give them distinct and peculiar names. This, by the way, may give us some light into the different state and growth of languages, which, being suited only to convenience of communication, are proportioned to the notions men have, and the commerce of thoughts familiar amongst them, and not to the reality or extent of things, nor to the various respects might be found amongst them, nor the different abstract considerations might be framed about them. Where they had no philosophical notions, there they had no terms to express them. And it is no wonder men should have framed no names for those things they found no occasion to discourse of. From whence it is easy to imagine why, as in some countries, they may have not so much as the name for a horse, and in others, where they are more careful of the pedigrees of their horses than of their own, that there they may have not only names for particular horses, but also of their several relations of kindred to one another. Thirdly, sometimes the foundation of considering things with reference to one another is some act whereby anyone comes by a moral right, power, or obligation to do something. Thus, a general is one that hath power to command an army, and an army under a general is a collection of armed men obliged to obey one man. A citizen or a burgher is one who has a right to certain privileges in this or that place. All this sort depending upon men's wills or agreement in society, I call instituted or voluntary, and may be distinguished from the natural in that they are most, if not all of them, some way or another alterable and separable from the persons to whom they have sometimes belonged, though neither of the substances so related be destroyed. Now, though all these are reciprocal as well as the rest, and contain in them a reference of 2 things one to another, yet because one of the 2 things often wants a relative name, importing that reference, men usually take no notice of it, and the relation is commonly overlooked. V.g. a patron and client are easily allowed to be relations, but a constable or dictator are not so readily, at first hearing, considered as such. Because there is no peculiar name for those who are under the command of a dictator or constable, expressing a relation to either of them, though it be certain that either of them hath a certain power over some others, and so is so far related to them, as well as a patron is to his client, or a general to his army. 4. Fourthly, there is another sort of relation, which is the conformity or disagreement men's voluntary actions have to a rule to which they are referred, and by which they are judged of, which, I think, may be called moral relation, as being that which denominates our moral actions and deserves well to be examined, there being no part of knowledge wherein we should be more careful to get determined ideas and avoid, as much as may be, obscurity and confusion. Human actions, when with their various ends, objects, manners, and circumstances, they are framed into distinct complex ideas, are, as has been shown, so many mixed modes, a great part whereof have names annexed to them. Thus, supposing gratitude to be a readiness to acknowledge and return kindness received, polygamy to be the having more wives than one at once, when we frame these notions thus in our minds, we have there so many determined ideas of mixed modes. But this is not all that concerns our actions. It is not enough to have determined ideas of them and to know what names belong to such and such combinations of ideas. We have a farther and greater concernment, and that is to know whether such actions so made up are morally good or bad. 5. Good and evil, as hath been shown, are nothing but pleasure or pain, or that which occasions or procures pleasure or pain to us. Moral good and evil, then, is only the conformity or disagreement of our voluntary actions to some law, whereby good or evil is drawn on us by the will and power of the lawmaker, which good and evil, pleasure or pain, attending our observance, or breach of the law by the decree of the lawmaker is what we call reward and punishment. 6. Of these moral rules or laws to which men generally refer, and by which they judge of the rectitude or pravity of their actions, there seem to me to be 3 sorts, with their 3 different enforcements or rewards and punishments. For since it would be utterly in vain to suppose a rule set to the free actions of men without annexing to it some enforcement of good and evil to determine his will, we must, wherever we suppose a law, suppose also some reward or punishment annexed to that law. It would be in vain for one intelligent being to set a rule to the actions of another if he had it not in his power to reward the compliance with and punish deviation from his rule by some good and evil that is not the natural product and consequence of the action itself. For that being a natural convenience or inconvenience would operate of itself without a law. This, if I mistake not, is the true nature of all law, properly so called. 7. The laws that men generally refer their actions to judge of their rectitude or obliquity, seem to me to be these 3. 1. The divine law. 2. The civil law. 3. The law of opinion or reputation, if I may so call it. By the relation they bear to the first of these, men judge whether their actions are sins or duties, by the second whether they be criminal or innocent, and by the third whether they be virtues or vices. 8. First, the divine law, whereby I mean that law which God has set to the actions of men, whether promulgated to them by the light of nature or the voice of revelation. That God has given a rule whereby men should govern themselves, I think there is nobody so brutish as to deny. He has a right to do it. We are his creatures. He has goodness and wisdom to direct our actions to that which is best, and he has power to enforce it by rewards and punishment of infinite weight and duration in another life. For nobody can take us out of his hands. This is the only true touchstone of moral rectitude, and by comparing them to this law it is that men judge of the most considerable moral good or evil of their actions. That is, whether as duties or sins, they are like to procure them happiness or misery from the hands of the Almighty. 9. Secondly, the civil law, the rule set by the Commonwealth to the actions of those who belong to it, is another rule to which men refer their actions, to judge whether they be criminal or no. This law nobody overlooks, the rewards and punishment that enforce it being ready at hand and suitable to the power that makes it, which is the force of the Commonwealth engaged to protect the lives, liberties, and possessions of those who live according to its law, and has power to take away life, liberty, or goods from him who disobeys, which is the punishment of offenses committed against this law. 10. Thirdly, the law of opinion or reputation. Virtue and vice are names pretended and supposed everywhere to stand for actions in their own nature, right and wrong. And as far as they really are so applied, they so far are coincident with the divine law above mentioned. But yet whatever is pretended, this is visible that these names, virtue and vice, in the particular instances of their application, through the several nations and societies of men in the world, are constantly attributed only to such actions as in each country and society are in reputation or discredit. Nor is it to be thought strange that men everywhere should give the name of virtue to those actions which amongst them are judged praiseworthy, and call that vice which they account blamable, since otherwise they would condemn themselves, if they should think anything right to which they allowed not condemnation, anything wrong which they let pass without blame. Thus the measure of what is everywhere called and esteemed virtue and vice is the approbation or dislike, praise or blame, which by a secret and tacit consent establishes itself in several societies, tribes, and clubs of men in the world, whereby several actions come to find credit or disgrace amongst them, according to the judgment, maxims, or fashions of that place. For though men uniting into politic societies have resigned up to the public the disposing of all their force, so that they cannot employ it against any fellow citizens any farther than the law of the country directs, Yet they retain still the power of thinking well or ill, approving or disapproving of the actions of those whom they live amongst and converse with. And by this approbation and dislike they establish amongst themselves what they will call virtue and vice. 11. That this is the common measure of virtue and vice will appear to anyone who considers that though that passes for vice in one country, which is counted a virtue, or at least not vice in another, yet everywhere virtue and praise, vice and blame go together. Virtue is everywhere that which is thought praiseworthy, and nothing else but that which has the allowance of public esteem is called virtue. Virtue and praise are so united that they are called often by the same name. Sunt sua premia laudi, says Virgil, and so Cicero. Nihil habet natura praestatanis, quam honestatem, quam laudem, quam dignitatem, quam decis, which he tells you are all the names for the same thing. This is the language of the heathen philosophers, who well understood wherein their notion of virtue and vice consisted, and though perhaps by the different temper, education, fashion, maxims, or interests of different sorts of men, it fell out that what was thought praiseworthy in one place escaped not censure in another, and so in different societies virtues and vices were changed, yet as to the main, they for the most part kept the same everywhere. For since nothing can be more natural than to encourage with esteem and reputation that wherein everyone finds his advantage, and to blame and discountenance the contrary, it is no wonder that esteem and discredit, virtue and vice, should in great measure everywhere correspond with the unchangeable rule of right and wrong which the law of God hath established. There being nothing that so directly and visibly secures and advances the general good of mankind in this world as obedience to the laws he has set them, and nothing that breeds such mischiefs and confusion as the neglect of them. And therefore men, without renouncing all sense and reason, and their own interest, which they are so constantly true to do, could not generally mistake in placing their commendation and blame on that side that really deserved it not. Nay, even those men whose practice was otherwise failed not to give their approbation right, few being depraved to that degree as not to condemn, at least in others, the faults they themselves were guilty of, whereby even in the corruption of manners the true boundaries of the law of nature, which ought to be the rule of virtue and vice, were pretty well preferred, so that even the exhortations of inspired teachers have not feared to appeal to common repute. Whatsoever is lovely, whatsoever is of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise. 12. If anyone shall imagine that I have forgot my own notion of a law, when I make a law, whereby men judge of virtue and vice, to be nothing else but the consent of private men, who have not authority enough to make a law, especially wanting that which is so necessary and essential to a law, a power to enforce it. I think I may say that he who imagines commendation and disgrace not to be strong motives to men, to accommodate themselves to the opinions and rules of those with whom they converse, seems little skilled in the nature or history of mankind, the greatest part whereof he shall find to govern themselves chiefly, if not solely, by this law of fashion. And so they do that which keeps them in reputation with their company, little regard to the laws of gods or the magistrate. The penalties that attend the breach of God's law, some, nay, perhaps most men, seldom seriously reflect on, and amongst those that do, many, whilst they break the law, entertain thoughts of future reconciliation, and making their peace for such breaches. And as to the punishments due from the laws of the commonwealth, they frequently flatter themselves with the hopes of impunity. But no man escapes the punishment of their censure and dislike who offends against the fashion and opinion of the company he keeps, and would recommend himself to. Nor is there one of 10,000 who is stiff and insensible enough to bear up under the constant dislike and condemnation of his own club. He must be of a strange and unusual constitution who can content himself to live in constant disgrace and disrepute with his own particular society. Solitude many men have sought and been reconciled to, but nobody that has the least thought or sense of a man about him can live in society under the constant dislike and ill opinion of his familiars and those he converses with. This is a burden too heavy for human suffering, and he must be made up of irreconcilable contradictions, who can take pleasure in company and yet be insensible of contempt and disgrace from his companions. 13. These three then, first the law of God, secondly the law of politic societies, thirdly the law of fashion or private censure, are those to which men variously compare their actions, and it is by their conformity to one of these laws that they take their measures, when they would judge of their moral rectitude and denominate their actions good or bad. 14. Whether the rule to which, as to a touchstone, we bring our voluntary actions to examine them by, and try their goodness, and accordingly to name them, which is, as it were, the mark of the value we set upon them. Whether I say we take that rule from the fashion of the country, or the will of a lawmaker, the mind is easily able to observe the relation any action hath to it, and to judge whether the action agrees or disagrees with the rule, and so hath a notion of moral goodness or evil, which is either conformity or not conformity of any action to that rule, and therefore is often called moral rectitude. This rule being nothing but a collection of several simple ideas, the conformity thereto is but so ordering the action that the simple ideas belonging to it may correspond to those which the law requires. And thus we see how moral beings and notions are founded on and terminated in these simple ideas we have received from sensation or reflection. For example, let us consider the complex idea we signify by the word murder. And when we have taken it asunder and examined all the particulars, we shall find them to amount to a collection of simple ideas derived from reflection or sensation. First, from reflection on the operations of our own minds, we have the ideas of willing, considering, purposing beforehand, malice, or wishing ill to another, and also of life or perception and self-motion. Secondly, from sensation, we have the collection of those simple, sensible ideas which are to be found in a man and of some action, whereby we put an end to perception and motion in the same man, all which simple ideas are comprehended in the word murder. This collection of simple ideas being found by me to agree or disagree with the esteem of the country I have been bred in, and to be held by most men there worthy praise or blame, I call the action virtuous or vicious. If I have the will of a supreme invisible lawgiver for my rule, then, as I suppose the action commanded or forbidden by God, I call it good or evil, sin or duty. And if I compare it to the civil law, the rule made by the legislative power of the country, I call it lawful or unlawful, a crime or no crime. So that whensoever we take the rule of moral actions, or by what standards soever we frame in our minds the ideas of virtues or vices, they consist only and are made up of collections of simple ideas, which we originally received from sense or reflection, and their rectitude or obliquity consists in the agreement or disagreement with those patterns prescribed by some law. 15. To conceive rightly of moral actions, we must first take notice of them under this twofold consideration. First, as they are in themselves each made up of such a collection of simple ideas. Thus, drunkenness or lying signifies such or such a collection of simple ideas, which I call mixed modes. And in this sense, they are as much positive absolute ideas as the drinking of a horse or speaking of a parrot. Secondly, our actions are considered good, bad, or indifferent. And in this respect, they are relative, it being their conformity to or disagreement with some rule that makes them to be regular or irregular, good or bad. And so, as far as they are compared with a rule and thereupon denominated, they come under relation. Thus, the challenging and fighting with a man as it is a certain positive mode or particular sort of action by particular ideas distinguished from all others is called dueling, which when considered in relation to the law of God will deserve the name sin. To the law of fashion, in some countries, valor and virtue. And to the municipal laws of some governments, a capital crime. In this case, when the positive mode has one name and another name as it stands in relation to the law, the distinction may as easily be observed as it is in substances where one name, v.g. man, is used to signify the thing, another, v.g. father, to signify the relation. 16. But because very frequently the positive idea of the action and its moral relation are comprehended together under one name, and the same word made use of to express both the mode or action and its moral rectitude or obliquity, therefore the relation itself is less taken notice of, and there is often no distinction made between the positive idea of the action and the reference it has to a rule. By which confusion of these two distinct considerations under one term, those who yield too easily to the impression of sounds and are forward to take names for things are often misled in their judgment of actions. Thus the taking from another what is his, without his knowledge or allowance, is properly called stealing. But that name being commonly understood to signify also the moral pravity of the action and to denote its contrariety to the law, men are apt to condemn whatever they hear called stealing as an ill action, disagreeing with the rule of right. And yet the private taking away his sword from a madman to prevent his doing mischief, though it be properly denominated stealing as the name of such a mixed mode, yet when compared to the law of God and considered in its relation to that supreme rule, it is no sin or transgression, though the name stealing ordinarily carries such an intimation with it. 17. And thus much for the relation of human actions to a law, which therefore I call moral relation. It would make a volume to go over all sorts of relations. It is not therefore to be expected that I should here mention them all. It suffices to our present purpose to show by these what the ideas are we have of this comprehensive consideration called relation, which is so various and the occasions of it so many as there can be of comparing things one to another, that it is not very easy to reduce it to rules or under just heads. Those I have mentioned, I think, are some of the most considerable, and such as may serve to let us see from whence we get our ideas of relations and wherein they are founded. But before I quit this argument from what has been said, give me leave to observe. 18. First, that it is evident that all relation terminates in, and is ultimately founded on those simple ideas we have got from sensation or reflection, so that all that we have in our thoughts ourselves, if we think of anything or have any meaning, or would signify to others, when we use words standing for relations, is nothing but some simple ideas, or collections of simple ideas, compared with another. This is so manifest in that sort called proportional that nothing can be more. For when a man says honey is sweeter than wax, it is plain that his thoughts in this relation terminate in this simple idea, sweetness, which is equally true of all the rest. Though where they are compounded or decompounded, the simple ideas they are made up of are, perhaps, seldom taken notice of. V.g., when the word father is mentioned, first there is meant that particular species or collective idea signified by the word man. Secondly, those sensible, simple ideas signified by the word generation. And thirdly, the effects of it, all the simple ideas signified by the word child. So the word friend being taken for a man who loves and is ready to do good to another, has all these following ideas to the making of it up. First, all the simple ideas comprehended in the word man or intelligent being. Secondly, the idea of love. Thirdly, the idea of readiness or disposition. Fourthly, the idea of action, which is any kind of thought or motion. Fifthly, the idea of good, which signifies anything that may advance his happiness and terminates at last, if examined, in particular simple ideas, of which the word good in general signifies anyone, but if removed from all simple ideas quite, it signifies nothing at all. And thus also all moral words terminate at last, though perhaps more remotely, in a collection of simple ideas, the immediate signification of relative words being very often other supposed known relations, which, if traced one to another, still end in simple ideas. 19. Secondly, that in relations we have, for the most part, if not always, as clear a notion of the relation as we have of those simple ideas wherein it is founded, agreement or disagreement, whereupon relation depends, being things whereof we have commonly as clear ideas as of any other whatsoever, it being but the distinguishing simple ideas or their degrees one from another, without which we could have no distinct knowledge at all. For if I have a clear idea of sweetness, light, or extension, I have too of equal, or more or less of each of these. If I know what it is for one man to be born of a woman, vis sempronia, I know what it is for another man to be born of the same woman, sempronia, and so have as clear a notion of brothers as of births, and perhaps clearer. For if I believed that Sempronia dug Titus out of the parsley bed, as they used to tell children, and thereby became his mother, and that afterwards in the same manner she dug Caius out of the parsley bed, I had as clear a notion of the relation of brothers between them as if I had all the skill of a midwife. The notion that the same woman contributed as mother equally to their births, though I were ignorant or mistaken in the manner of it, being that on which I grounded the relation, and that they agreed in that circumstance of birth, let it be what it will. The comparing with them in their descent from the same person without knowing the particular circumstances of that descent is enough to found my notion of their having or not having the relation of brothers. But though the ideas of particular relations are capable of being as clear and distinct in the minds of those who will duly consider them as those of mixed modes, and more determined than those of substances, yet the names belonging to relation are often as doubtful and uncertain signification as those of substances or mixed modes, and much more than those of simple ideas. Because relative words being the marks of this comparison, which is made only by men's thoughts, and is an idea only in men's minds, men frequently apply them to different comparisons of things according to their own imaginations, which do not always correspond with those of others using the same name. 20. Thirdly, that in these I call moral relations, I have a true notion of relation by comparing the action with the rule, whether the rule be true or false. For if I measure anything by a yard, I know whether the thing I measured be longer or shorter than that supposed yard, though perhaps the yard I measure by be not exactly the standard, which indeed is another inquiry. For though the rule be erroneous, and I mistaken in it, yet the agreement or disagreement observable in that which I compare with makes me perceive the relation. Though measuring by a wrong rule, I shall thereby be brought to judge amiss of its moral rectitude, because I have tried it by that which is not the true rule. Yet I am not mistaken in the relation which that action bears the rule I compare it to, which is agreement or disagreement. End of section 27.
Section 28 of An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Book 2, by John Locke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 29 of Clear and Obscure, Distinct and Confused Ideas. 1. Having shown the original of our ideas, and taken a view of their several sorts, considered the difference between the simple and the complex, and observed how the complex ones are divided into those of modes, substances, and relations, all which I think is necessary to be done by anyone who would acquaint himself thoroughly with the progress of the mind in its apprehension and knowledge of things. It will perhaps be thought I have dwelt long enough upon the examination of ideas. I must nevertheless crave leave to offer some few other considerations concerning them. The first is that some are clear and others obscure, some distinct and others confused. 2. The perception of the mind being most aptly explained by words relating to the sight, we shall best understand what is meant by clear and obscure in our ideas by reflecting on what we call clear and obscure in the objects of sight. Light being that which discovers to us visible objects, we give the name of obscure to that which is not placed in a light sufficient to discover minutely to us the figure and colors which are observable in it, and which in a better light would be discernible. In like manner, our simple ideas are clear when they are, such as the objects themselves from whence they were taken, did our mind in a well-ordered sensation or perception present them. Whilst the memory retains them thus, and can produce them to the mind whenever it has occasion to consider them, they are clear ideas. So far as they either want anything of the original exactness, or have lost any of their first freshness, and are, as it were, faded or tarnished by time, so far are they obscure. Complex ideas, as they are made up of simple ones, so they are clear when the ideas that go to their composition are clear, and the number and order of those simple ideas that are the ingredients of any complex one is determinate and certain. 3. The causes of obscurity in simple ideas seem to be either dull organs, or very slight and transient impressions made by the objects, or else a weakness in the memory not able to retain them as received. For, to return again to visible objects, to help us to apprehend this matter, if the organs or faculties of perception, like wax over-hardened with cold, will not receive the impression of the seal from the usual impulse wont to imprint it, or, like wax of a temper too soft, will not hold it well when well imprinted, or else supposing the wax of a temper fit, but the seal not applied with a sufficient force to make clear impression, in any of these cases the print left by the seal will be obscure. This, I suppose, needs no application to make it plainer. 4. As a clear idea is that whereof the mind has such a full and evident perception, as it does receive from an outward object operating duly on a well-disposed organ, so a distinct idea is that wherein the mind perceives a difference from all other. And a confused idea is such a one as is not sufficiently distinguishable from another from which it ought to be different. 5. If no idea be confused, but such as is not sufficiently distinguishable from another from which it should be different, it will be hard, may anyone say, to find anywhere a confused idea. For let any idea be as it will, it can be no other but such as the mind perceives it to be. And that very perception sufficiently distinguishes it from all other ideas, which cannot be other, i.e. different, without being perceived to be so. No idea therefore can be undistinguishable from another, from which it ought to be different, unless you would have it different from itself, for from all other it is evidently different. 6. To remove this difficulty, and to help us to conceive aright what it is that makes the confusion ideas are at any time chargeable with, we must consider that things ranked under distinct names are supposed different enough to be distinguished, and so each sort by its peculiar name may be marked and discoursed of apart upon any occasion. And there is nothing more evident than that the greatest part of different names are supposed to stand for different things. Now every idea a man has being visibly what it is, and distinct from all other ideas but itself, that which makes it confused is, when it is such that it may as well be called by another name as that which it is expressed by. The difference which keeps the things, to be ranked under those two different names, distinct, and makes some of them belong rather to the one and some of them to the other of those names, being left out. And so the distinction which was intended to be kept up by those different names is quite lost. 7. The defaults which usually occasion this confusion, I think, are chiefly these following. First, when any complex idea, for it is complex ideas that are most liable to confusion, is made up of too small a number of simple ideas, and such only as are common to other things, whereby the differences that make it deserve a different name are left out. Thus he that has an idea made up of barely the simple ones of a beast with spots has but a confused idea of a leopard, it not being thereby sufficiently distinguished from a lynx and several other sorts of beasts that are spotted. So that such an idea, though it hath the peculiar name leopard, is not distinguishable from those designed by the names lynx or panther, and may as well come under the name lynx as leopard. How much the custom of defining of words by general terms contributes to make the ideas we would express by them confused and undetermined, I leave others to consider. This is evident that confused ideas are such as render the use of words uncertain, and take away the benefit of distinct names. When ideas for which we use different terms have not a difference answerable to their distinct names, and so cannot be distinguished by them, there it is that they are truly confused. 8. Secondly, another fault which makes our ideas confused is, when though the particulars that make up any idea are in number enough, yet they are so jumbled together that it is not easily discernible whether it more belongs to the name that is given it than to any other. There is nothing proper to make us conceive this confusion than a sort of pictures usually shown as surprising pieces of art, wherein the colors, as they are laid by the pencil on the table itself, mark out very odd and unusual figures, and have no discernible order in their position. This draft, thus made up of parts wherein no symmetry nor order appears, is in itself no more a confused thing than the picture of a cloudy sky, wherein though there be as little order of colors or figures to be found, yet nobody thinks it a confused picture. What is it thus that makes it be thought confused, since the want of symmetry does not? As it is plain it does not, for another draft made, barely an imitation of this, could not be called confused. I answer, that which makes it be thought confused is the applying it to some name to which it does not more discernibly belong than to some other, v.g., when it is said to be the picture of a man, or Caesar, then anyone with reason counts it confused, because it is not discernible in that state to belong more to the name man, or Caesar, than to the name baboon, or Pompey, which are supposed to stand for different ideas from those signified by man, or Caesar. But when a cylindrical mirror, placed right, hath reduced those irregular lines on the table into their due order and proportion, then the confusion ceases, and the eye presently sees that it is a man or Caesar, i.e., that it belongs to those names, and that it is sufficiently distinguishable from a baboon or Pompey, i.e., from the ideas signified by those names. Just thus it is with our ideas, which are, as it were, the pictures of things. No one of these mental drafts, however the parts are put together, can be called confused, for they are plainly discernible as they are, till it be ranked under some ordinary name, to which it cannot be discerned to belong any more than it does to some other name of an allowed different signification. 9. Thirdly, a third defect that frequently gives the name of confused to our ideas is, when any one of them is uncertain and undetermined. Thus we may observe men who, not forbearing to use the ordinary words of their language till they have learned their precise signification, change the idea they make this or that term stand for almost as often as they use it. He that does this out of uncertainty of what he should leave out or put into this idea of church or idolatry every time he thinks of either, and holds not steady to any one precise combination of ideas that makes it up, is said to have a confused idea of idolatry or the church, though this be still for the same reason as the former, namely, because a mutable idea, if we will allow it to be one idea, cannot belong to one name rather than another, and so loses the distinction that distinct names are designed for. 10. By what has been said, we may observe how much names, as supposed steady signs of things, and by their difference to stand for and keep things distinct that in themselves are different, are the occasion of denominating ideas distinct or confused by a secret and unobserved reference the mind makes of its ideas to such names. This perhaps will be fuller understood after what I say of words in the third book has been read and considered. But without taking notice of such a reference of ideas to distinct names as the signs of distinct things, it will be hard to say what a confused idea is. And therefore, when a man designs by any name a sort of things, or any one particular thing, distinct from all others, the complex idea he annexes to that name is the more distinct, the more particular the ideas are, and the greater and more determinate the number and order of them is, whereof it is made up. For the more it has of these, the more it has still the perceivable differences, whereby it is kept separate and distinct from all ideas belonging to other names, even those that approach nearest to it, and thereby all confusion with them is avoided. 11. Confusion, making it a difficulty to separate two things that should be separated, concerns always two ideas, and those most which most approach one another. Whenever therefore we suspect any idea to be confused, we must examine what other it is in danger to be confounded with, or which it cannot easily be separated from. And that will always be found an idea belonging to another name, and so should be a different thing, from which yet it is not sufficiently distinct, being either the same with it, or making a part of it, or at least as properly called by that name as the other it is ranked under, and so keeps not that difference from the other idea, which the different names import. 12. This, I think, is the confusion proper to ideas, which still carries with it a secret reference to names. At least, if there be any other confusion of ideas, this is that which most of all disorders men's thoughts and discourses. Ideas, as ranked under names, being those that, for the most part, men reason of within themselves, and always those which they commune about with others, and therefore where there are supposed two different ideas marked by two different names, which are not as distinguishable as the sounds that stand for them, there never fails to be confusion. And where any ideas are distinct as the ideas of those two sounds they are marked by, there can be between them no confusion. The way to prevent it is to collect and unite into one complex idea as precisely as is possible all those ingredients whereby it is differenced from others, and to them so united in a determinate number and order apply steadily the same name. But this neither accommodating men's ease or vanity, or serving any design but that of naked truth, which is not always the thing aimed for. Such exactness is rather to be wished than hoped for. And since the loose application of names to undetermined, variable, and almost no ideas served both to cover our own ignorance as well as to perplex and confound others, which goes for learning and superiority in knowledge, it is no wonder that most men should use it themselves, whilst they complain of it in others. Though I think no small part of the confusion to be found in the notions of men might by care and ingenuity be avoided, yet I am far from concluding it everywhere wilful. Some ideas are so complex, and made up of so many parts, that the memory does not easily retain the very same precise combination of simple ideas under one name. Much less are we able constantly to divine for what precise complex idea such a name stands in another man's use of it. From the first of these follows confusion in a man's own reasonings and opinions within himself. From the latter, frequent confusion in discoursing and arguing with others. But having more at large treated of words, their defects and abuses in the following book, I shall here say no more of it. 13. Our complex ideas being made up of collections, and so variety of simple ones, may accordingly be very clear and distinct in one part, and very obscure and confused in another. In a man who speaks of a kiliadron, or a body of 1,000 sides, the ideas of the figure may be very confused, though that of the number be very distinct, so that he, being able to discourse and demonstrate concerning that part of his complex idea, which depends upon the number of 1,000, he is apt to think he has a distinct idea of a kiliadron, though it be plain he has no precise idea of this figure, so as to distinguish it by that from one that has but 999 sides. The not observing whereof causes no small error in men's thoughts, and confusion in their discourses. 14. He that thinks he has a distinct idea of the figure of a kiliadron, let him for trial's sake take another parcel of the same uniform matter, namely gold or wax, of an equal bulk, and make it into a figure of 999 sides. He will, I doubt not, be able to distinguish these two ideas one from another by the number of sides, and reason and argue distinctly about them whilst he keeps his thoughts and reasoning to that part only of these ideas, which is contained in their numbers, as that the sides of the one could be divided into two equal numbers, and of the others not, etc. But when he goes about to distinguish them by their figure, he will there be presently at a loss, and not be able, I think, to frame in his mind two ideas, one of them distinct from the other by the bare figure of these two pieces of gold, as he could if the same parcels of gold were made into a cube, the other a figure of 5 sides. in which incomplete ideas we are very apt to impose on ourselves and wrangle with others, especially where they have particular and familiar names. For being satisfied in that part of the idea which we have clear, and the name which is familiar to us, being applied to the whole, containing that part also which is imperfect and obscure, we are apt to use it for that confused part, and draw deductions from it in the obscure part of its signification as confidently as we do from the other. 15. Having frequently in our mouths the name eternity, we are apt to think we have a positive, comprehensive idea of it, which is as much as to say that there is no part of that duration which is not clearly contained in our idea. It is true that he that thinks so may have a clear idea of duration. He may also have a very clear idea of a very great length of duration. He may also have a clear idea of the comparison of that great one with still a greater. But it not being possible for him to include in this idea of any duration, let it be as great as it will, the whole extent together of a duration where he supposes no end, that part of his idea, which is still beyond the bounds of that large duration he represents to his own thoughts, is very obscure and undetermined. And hence it is that in disputes and reasonings concerning eternity or any other infinite, we are apt to blunder and involve ourselves in manifest absurdities. 16. In matter we have no clear ideas of the smallness of parts much beyond the smallest that occur to any of our senses, and therefore when we talk of the divisibility of matter in infinitum, though we have clear ideas of division and divisibility, and have also clear ideas of parts made out of a whole by division, yet we have but very obscure and confused ideas of corpuscles or minute bodies to be divided, when by former divisions they are reduced to a smallness much exceeding the perception of any of our senses. And so all that we have clear and distinct ideas of is of what division in general or abstractedly is, and the relation of totem and parts, but of the bulk of the body, to be thus infinitely divided after certain progressions, I think, we have no clear nor distinct idea at all. For I ask anyone, whether taking the smallest atom of dust he ever saw, he has any distinct idea, bidding still the number which concerns not extension, betwixt the 100,000th and the 1,000,000th part of it, or if he thinks he can refine his ideas to that degree without losing sight of them, let him add 10 ciphers to each of those numbers. Such a degree of smallness is not unreasonable to be supposed, since the division carried on so far brings it no nearer the end of infinite division than the first division into 2 halves does. I must confess, for my part, I have no clear distinct ideas of the different bulk or extension of those bodies, having but a very obscure one of either of them. So that I think, when we talk of division of bodies in infinitum, our idea of their distinct bulks, which is the subject and foundation of division, comes, after a little progression, to be confounded and almost lost in obscurity. For that idea which is to represent only bigness must be very obscure and confused, which we cannot distinguish from one 10 times as big, but only by number. So we have clear distinct ideas, we may say, of 10 and 1, but no distinct ideas of 2 such extensions. It is plain from hence that when we talk of infinite divisibility of body, or extension, our distinct and clear ideas are only of numbers, but the clear distinct ideas of extension, after some progress of division, are quite lost. And of such minute parts we have no distinct ideas at all, but it returns, as all our ideas of infinite do, at last to that of number always to be added, but thereby never amounts to any distinct idea of actual infinite parts. We have, it is true, a clear idea of division as often as we think of it, but thereby we have no more a clear idea of infinite parts in matter than we have a clear idea of an infinite number, by being able still to add new numbers to any assigned numbers we have. Endless divisibility giving us no more a clear and distinct idea of actually infinite parts than endless addability, if I may so speak, gives us a clear and distinct idea of an actually infinite number. They both being only in a power still of increasing the number, be it already as great as it will, so that of what remains to be added, wherein consists the infinity, we have but an obscure, imperfect, and confused idea, from or about which we can argue or reason with no certainty or clearness, no more than we can in arithmetic, about a number of which we have no such distinct idea as we have of 4 or 100, but only this relative obscure one, that compared to any other it is still bigger. And we have no more a clear positive idea of it when we say or conceive it is bigger or more than 400 million, than if we should say it is bigger than 40 or 4. 400 million having no nearer proportion to the end of addition or number than 4. For he that adds only 4 to 4, and so proceeds, shall as soon come to the end of all addition, as he that adds 400 million to 400 million. And so likewise in eternity, he that has an idea of but 4 years has as much a positive complete idea of eternity as he that has one of 400 million of years. For what remains of eternity beyond either of these two numbers of years is as clear to the one as the other, i.e., neither of them has any clear positive idea of it at all. For he that adds only 4 years to 4, and so on, shall as soon reach eternity as he that adds 400 million of years, and so on, or if he please doubles the increase as often as he will. The remaining abyss being still as far beyond the end of all these progressions as it is from the length of a day or an hour. For nothing finite bears any proportion to infinite, and therefore our ideas, which are all finite, cannot bear any. Thus it is also in our idea of extension, when we increase it by addition, as well as when we diminish it by division, and would enlarge our thoughts to infinite space. After a few doublings of those ideas of extension, which are the largest we are accustomed to have, we lose the clear distinct idea of that space. It becomes a confusedly great one, with a surplus of still greater, about which, when we would argue or reason, we shall always find ourselves at a loss. Confused ideas in our arguings and deductions from that part of them which is confused, always leading us into confusion. End of section 28.
Section 29 of an Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Book 2, by John Locke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 30 of Real and Fantastical Ideas. Number 1. Besides what we have already mentioned concerning ideas, other considerations belong to them, in reference to things from whence they are taken, or which they may be supposed to represent. And thus, I think, they may come under a threefold distinction, and are first, either real or fantastical. Secondly, adequate or inadequate. Thirdly, true or false. First, by real ideas, I mean such as have a foundation in nature, such as have a conformity with the real being and existence of things, or with their archetypes. Fantastical or chimerical, I call such as have no foundation in nature, nor have any conformity with that reality of being to which they are tacitly referred as to their archetypes. If we examine the several sorts of ideas before mentioned, we shall find that, second, first, our simple ideas are all real. All agree to the reality of things, not that they are all of them the images of representations of what does exist, the contrary whereof in all but the primary qualities of bodies has been already shown. But though whiteness and coldness are no more in snow than pain is, yet those ideas of whiteness and coldness, pain, etc., being in us the effects of powers in things without us, ordained by our Maker, to produce in us such sensations, they are real ideas in us, whereby we distinguish the qualities that are really in things themselves. For these, several appearances being designed to be the mark, whereby we are to know and distinguish things which we have to do with. Our ideas do as well serve us to that purpose, and are as real distinguishing characters, whether they be only constant effects or else exact resemblances of something in the things themselves. The reality lying in that steady correspondence they have with the distinct constitutions of real beings. But whether they answer to those constitutions as to causes or patterns, it matters not. It suffices that they are constantly produced by them, and thus our simple ideas are all real and true, because they answer and agree to those powers of things which produce them in our minds, that being all that is requisite to make them real, and not fictions at pleasure. For in simple ideas, as has been shown, the mind is wholly confined to the operation of things upon it, and can make to itself no simple idea, more than what it has received. Third, though the mind be wholly passive in respect of its simple ideas, yet, I think, we may say, it is not so in respect of its complex ideas, for those being combinations of simple ideas put together and united under one general name, it is plain that the mind of man uses some kind of liberty in forming those complex ideas. How else comes it to pass that one man's idea of gold or justice is different from another's, but because he has put in or left out of his some simple idea which the other has not? The question then is, which of these are real, and which barely imaginary combinations? What collections agree to the reality of things, and what not? And to this I say that. Number 4. Secondly, mixed modes and relations having no other reality but what they have in the minds of men. There is nothing more required to this kind of ideas to make them real, but that they be so framed that there be a possibility of existing conformable to them. These ideas themselves, being archetypes, cannot differ from their archetypes, and so cannot be chimerical, unless any one will jumble together in them inconsistent ideas. Indeed, as any of them have the names of a known language assigned to them, by which he that has them in his mind would signify them to others, so bare possibility of existing is not enough. They must have a conformity to the ordinary signification of the name that is given them, that they may not be thought fantastical, as if a man would give the name of justice to that idea, which common use calls liberality. But this fantasticalness relates more to propriety of speech than reality of ideas. For a man to be undisturbed in danger, sedately to consider what is fittest to be done, and to execute it steadily, is a mixed mode, or a complex idea of an action which may exist. But to be undisturbed in danger, without using one's reason or industry, is what is also possible to be, and so is as real an idea as the other, though the first of these, having the name courage given to it, may in respect of that name be a right or wrong idea. But the other, whilst it has not a common received name of any known language assigned to it, is not capable of any deformity, being made with no reference to anything but itself. Number 5. Thirdly, our complex ideas of substances, being made all of them in reference to things existing without us, and intended to be representations of substances as they really are no further real than as they are such combinations of simple ideas as are really united and coexist in things without us. On the contrary, those are fantastical, which are made up of such collections of simple ideas as were really never united, never were found together in any substance, v.g. a rational creature consisting of a horse's head joined to a body of human shape, or such as the centaurs are described, or a body yellow, very malleable, fusible, and fixed, but lighter than common water, or an uniform, unorganized body, consisting as to sense all of similar parts, with perception and voluntary motion joined to it. Whether such substances as these can possibly exist or no, it is probable we do not know, but be that as it will, these ideas of substances being made conformable to no pattern existing that we know, and consisting of such collections of ideas as no substance ever showed us united together, they ought to pass with us for barely imaginary. But much more are those complex ideas, so which contain in them any inconsistency or contradiction of their parts. End of section 29.
Section 30 of An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Book 2, by John Locke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Bissett. Chapter 31 of Adequate and Inadequate Ideas. 1. Of our real ideas, some are adequate and some are inadequate. Those I call adequate, which perfectly represent those archetypes which the mind supposes them taken from, which it intends them to stand for, and to which it refers them. Inadequate ideas are such which are but a partial or incomplete representation of those archetypes to which they are referred, upon which account it is plain. 2. First, that all our simple ideas are adequate, because being nothing but the effects of certain powers in things, fitted and ordained by God to produce such sensations in us, they cannot but be correspondent and adequate to those powers, and we are sure they agree to the reality of things. For if sugar produce in us the ideas which we call whiteness and sweetness, we are sure there is a power in sugar to produce those ideas in our minds, or else they could not have been produced by it. And so each sensation answering the power that operates on any of our senses, the idea so produced is a real idea, and not a fiction of the mind which has no power to produce any simple idea, and cannot but be adequate, since it ought only to answer that power, and so all simple ideas are adequate. It is true, the things producing in us these simple ideas are but few of them denominated by us, as if they were only the causes of them, but as if those ideas were real beings in them. For though fire be called painful to the touch, whereby is signified the power of producing in us the idea of pain, yet it is denominated also light and hot, as if light and heat were really something in the fire, more than a power to excite these ideas in us, and therefore are called qualities in or of the fire. But these being nothing in truth but powers to excite such ideas in us, I must in that sense be understood when I speak of secondary qualities as being in things, or of their ideas as being the objects that excite them in us. Such ways of speaking, though accommodated to the vulgar notions, without which one cannot be well understood, yet truly signify nothing but those powers which are in things to excite certain sensations or ideas in us, since were there no fit organs to receive the impressions fire makes on the sight and touch, nor a mind joined to those organs to receive the ideas of light and heat by those impressions from the fire or sun, there would yet be no more light or heat in the world than there would be pain if there were no sensible creature to feel it, though the sun should continue just as it is now, and Mount Etna flame higher than ever it did. Solidity and extension and a termination of it, figure, with motion and rest, whereof we have the ideas, would be really in the world as they are, whether there were any sensible being to perceive them or no. And therefore we have reason to look on those as the real modifications of matter. And such are the exciting causes of all our various sensations from bodies. But this being an inquiry not belonging to this place, I shall enter no farther into it, but proceed to show what complex ideas are adequate and what not. 3. Secondly, our complex ideas of modes, being voluntary collections of simple ideas which the mind puts together without reference to any real archetypes or standing patterns existing anywhere, are and cannot but be adequate ideas. Because they, not being intended for copies of things really existing, but for archetypes made by the mind to rank and denominate things by, cannot want anything. They having each of them that combination of ideas and thereby that perfection which the mind intended they should, so that the mind acquiesces in them and can find nothing wanting. Thus, by having the idea of a figure with 3 sides meeting at 3 angles, I have a complete idea wherein I require nothing else to make it perfect. That the mind is satisfied with the perfection of this, its idea, is plain in that it does not conceive that any understanding hath or can have a more complete or perfect idea of that thing it signifies by the word triangle. Supposing it to exist, then itself has in that complex idea of 3 sides and 3 angles, in which is contained all that is or can be essential to it or necessary to complete it, wherever or however it exists. But in our ideas of substances it is otherwise. For their desiring to copy things as they really do exist and to present to ourselves that constitution on which all their properties depend, we perceive our ideas attain not that perfection we intend. We find they still want something we should be glad were in them, and so are all inadequate. But mixed modes and relations, being archetypes without patterns, and so having nothing to represent but themselves, cannot but be adequate, everything being so to itself. He that at first put together the idea of danger perceived, absence of disorder from fear, sedate consideration of what was justly to be done, and executing that without disturbance, or being deterred by the danger of it, had certainly in his mind that complex idea made up of that combination. And intending it to be nothing else but what is, nor to have in it any other simple ideas but what it hath, it could not also but be an adequate idea. And laying this up in his memory with the name courage annexed to it, to signify to others and denominate from thence any action he should observe to agree with it, had thereby a standard to measure and denominate actions by as they agreed to it. This idea thus made and laid up for a pattern must necessarily be adequate, being referred to nothing else but itself, nor made by any other original, but the good liking and will of him that first made this combination. 4. Indeed, another coming after, and in conversation learning from him the word courage, may make an idea, to which he gives the name courage, different from what the first author applied it to, and has in his mind when he uses it. And in this case, if he designs that his idea in thinking should be conformable to the other's idea, as the name he uses in speaking is conformable and sound to his, from whom he learned it, his idea may be very wrong and inadequate. because in this case, making the other man's idea the pattern of his idea in thinking, as the other man's word or sound is the pattern of his in speaking, his idea is so far defective and inadequate as it is distant from the archetype and pattern he refers it to and intends to express and signify by the name he uses for it, which name he would have to be a sign of the other man's idea, to which in its proper use it is primarily annexed, and of his own as agreeing to it, to which, if his own does not exactly correspond, it is faulty and inadequate. 5. Therefore, these complex ideas of modes, when they are referred by the mind and intended to correspond to the ideas in the mind of some other intelligent being, expressed by the names we apply to them, they may be very deficient, wrong, and inadequate, because they agree not to that which the mind designs to be their archetype and pattern, in which respect only any idea of modes can be wrong, imperfect, or inadequate. And on this account, our ideas of mixed modes are the most liable to be faulty of any other. But this refers more to proper speaking than knowing right. 6. Thirdly, what ideas we have of substances I have above showed. Now those ideas have in the mind a double reference. 1, sometimes they are referred to a supposed real essence of each species of things. 2, sometimes they are only designed to be pictures and representations in the mind of things that do exist by ideas of those qualities that are discoverable in them. In both which ways, these copies of those originals and archetypes are imperfect and inadequate. First, it is usual for men to make names of substances stand for things, as supposed to have certain real essences whereby they are of this or that species. And names standing for nothing but the ideas that are in men's minds, they must constantly refer their ideas to such real essences as to their archetypes. That men, especially such as have been bred up in the learning taught in this part of the world, do suppose certain specific essences of substances, which each individual in its several kinds is made conformable to and partakes of, is so far from needing proof that it will be thought strange if anyone should do otherwise. And thus they ordinarily apply the specific names they rank particular substances under to things, as distinguished by such specific real essences. Who is there almost who would not take it amiss if it should be doubted whether he called himself a man with any other meaning than as having the real essence of a man? And yet if you demand what those real essences are, it is plain men are ignorant and know them not. From whence it follows that the ideas they have in their minds, being referred to real essences as to archetypes which are unknown, must be so far from being adequate that they cannot be supposed to be any representation of them at all. The complex ideas we have of substances are, as it has been shown, certain collections of simple ideas that have been observed or supposed constantly to exist together. But such a complex idea cannot be the real essence of any substance, for then the properties we discover in that body would depend on that complex idea, and be deducible from it, and their necessary connection with it be known, as all properties of a triangle depend on, and, as far as they are discoverable, are deducible from the complex idea of 3 lines, including a space. But it is plain that in our complex ideas of substances are not contained such ideas on which all other qualities that are to be found in them do depend. The common idea men have of iron is a body of a certain color, weight, and hardness, and a property that they look on as belonging to it is malleableness. But yet, this property has no necessary connection with that complex idea or any part of it. And there is no more reason to think that malleableness depends on that color, weight, and hardness than that color or that weight depends on its malleableness. And yet, though we know nothing of these real essences, there is nothing more ordinary than that men should attribute the sorts of things to such essences. The particular parcel of matter which makes the ring I have on my finger is forwardly, by most men, supposed to have a real essence, whereby it is gold, and from whence these qualities flow which I find in it, viz., its peculiar color, weight, hardness, fusibility, fixedness, and change of color upon a slight touch of mercury, etc. This essence from which all these properties flow, when I inquire into it and search after it, I plainly perceive I cannot discover. The farthest I can go is only to presume that it is being nothing but body, its real essence or internal constitution on which these qualities depend, can be nothing but the figure, size, and connection of its solid parts, of neither of which, having any distinct perception at all, can I have any idea of its essence, which is the cause that it has that particular shining yellowness, a greater weight than anything I know of the same bulk, and a fitness to have its color changed by the touch of quicksilver. If anyone will say that the real essence and internal constitution on which these properties depend is not the figure, size, and arrangement or connection of its solid parts, but something else called its particular form, I am farther from having any idea of its real essence than I was before. For I have an idea of figure, size, and situation of solid parts in general, though I have none of the particular figure, size, or putting together of parts, whereby the qualities above mentioned are produced, which qualities I find in that particular parcel of matter that is on my finger, and not in another parcel of matter with which I cut the pen I write with. But when I am told that something besides the figure, size, and posture of the solid parts of that body is its essence, something called substantial form, of that I confess I have no idea at all, but only of the sound form, which is far enough from an idea of its real essence or constitution. The like ignorance as I have of the real essence of this particular substance, I have also of the real essence of all other natural ones, of which essences, I confess, I have no distinct ideas at all, and I am apt to suppose others, when they examine their own knowledge, will find in themselves, in this one point, the same sort of ignorance. 7. Now then, when men apply to this particular parcel of matter on my finger a general name already in use and denominate it gold, do they not ordinarily, or are they not understood to give it that name as belonging to a particular species of bodies having a real internal essence, by having of which essence this particular substance comes to be of that species and to be called by that name? If it be so, as it is plain it is, the name by which things are marked as having that essence must be referred primarily to that essence, and consequently the idea to which that name is given must be referred also to that essence and be intended to represent it. Which essence, since they, who so use the names, know not, their ideas of substances must be all inadequate in that respect, as not containing in them that real essence which the mind intends they should. 8. Secondly, those who, neglecting that useless supposition of unknown real essences whereby they are distinguished, endeavor to copy the substances that exist in the world by putting together the ideas of those sensible qualities which are found coexisting in them, though they come much nearer a likeness of them than those who imagine they know not what real specific essence is. Yet they arrive not at perfectly adequate ideas of those substances they would thus copy into their minds. Nor do those copies exactly and fully contain all that is to be found in their archetypes. Because those qualities and powers of substances whereof we make their complex ideas are so many and various that no man's complex idea contains them all. That our abstract ideas of substances do not contain in them all the simple ideas that are united in the things themselves, it is evident, in that men do rarely put into their complex idea of any substance all the simple ideas they do know to exist in it. Because endeavoring to make the signification of their names as clear and as little cumbersome as they can, they make their specific ideas of the sorts of substance, for the most part, of a few of those simple ideas which are to be found in them. But these having no original precedency or right to be put in, and make the specific idea more than others that are left out, it is plain that both these ways our ideas of substances are deficient and inadequate. The simple ideas whereof we make our complex ones of substances are all of them, bating only the figure and bulk of some sorts, powers, which, being relations to other substances, we can never be sure that we know all the powers that are in any one body, till we have tried what changes it is fitted to give to or receive from other substances in their several ways of application. which being impossible to be tried upon any one body, much less upon all, it is impossible we should have adequate ideas of any substance made up of a collection of all its properties. 9. Whosoever first lighted on a parcel of that sort of substance we denote by the word gold, could not rationally take the bulk and figure he observed in that lump to depend on its real essence or internal constitution. Therefore, those never went into his idea of that species of body, but its peculiar color, perhaps, and weight were the first he abstracted from it to make the complex idea of that species, which both are but powers, the one to affect our eyes after such a manner and to produce in us that idea we call yellow, and the other to force upwards any other body of equal bulk, they being put into a pair of equal scales, one against another. Another perhaps added to these the ideas of fusibility and fixedness, two other passive powers in relation to the operation of fire upon it. Another, its ductility and solubility in aqueous regia, two other powers relating to the operation of other bodies, in changing its outward figure or separation of it into insensible parts. These, or part of these, put together, usually make the complex idea in men's minds of that sort of body we call gold. 10. But no one who hath considered the properties of bodies in general, or this sort in particular, can doubt that this called gold has infinite other properties not contained in that complex idea. Some who have examined this species more accurately could, I believe, enumerate 10 times as many properties in gold, all of them as inseparable from its internal constitution as its color or weight. And it is probable, if anyone knew all the properties that are by diverse men known of this metal, there would be 100 times as many ideas go to the complex idea of gold, as any one man yet has in his, and yet perhaps that not be the 1,000th part of what is to be discovered in it. The changes which that one body is apt to receive and make in other bodies upon a due application, exceeding far not only what we know, but what we are apt to imagine, which will not appear so much a paradox to any one who will but consider how far men are yet from knowing all the properties of that one, no very compound figure, a triangle, though it be no small number that are already by mathematicians discovered of it. 11. So that all our complex ideas of substances are imperfect and inadequate, which would be so also in mathematical figures if we were to have our complex ideas of them only by collecting their properties in reference to other figures. How uncertain and imperfect would our ideas be of an ellipsis if we had no other idea of it but some few of its properties? Whereas, having in our plain idea the whole essence of that figure, we from thence discover those properties, and demonstratively see how they flow, and are inseparable from it. 12. Thus the mind has 3 sorts of abstract ideas or nominal essences. First, simple ideas which are ectupa or copies, but yet certainly adequate. Because being intended to express nothing but the power in things to produce in the mind such a sensation, that sensation, when it is produced, cannot but be the effect of that power. So the paper I write on having the power in the light, I speak according to the common notion of light, to produce in men the sensation which I call white, it cannot but be the effect of such a power in something without the mind. Since the mind has not the power to produce any such idea in itself, and being meant for nothing else but the effect of such a power, that simple idea is real and adequate. The sensation of white in my mind being the effect of that power which is in the paper to produce it, is perfectly adequate to that power, or else that power would produce a different idea. 13. Secondly, the complex ideas of substances are ectypes, copies too, but not perfect ones, not adequate, which is very evident to the mind in that it simply perceives that whatever collection of simple ideas it makes of any substance that exists, it cannot be sure that it exactly answers all that are in that substance. since not having tried all the operations of all other substances upon it, and found all the alterations it would receive from or cause in other substances, it cannot have an exact, adequate collection of all its active and passive capacities, and so not have an adequate complex idea of the powers of any substance existing and its relations, which is that sort of complex idea of substances we have. And after all, if we would have, and actually had in our complex idea, an exact collection of all the secondary qualities or powers of any substance, we should not yet thereby have an idea of the essence of that thing. For since the powers or qualities that are observable by us are not the real essence of that substance, but depend on it, and flow from it, any collection whatsoever of these qualities cannot be the real essence of that thing. Whereby it is plain that our ideas of substances are not adequate, are not what the mind intends them to be. Besides, a man has no idea of substance in general, nor knows what substance is in itself. 14. Thirdly, complex ideas of modes and relations are originals and archetypes, are not copies nor made after the pattern of any real existence to which the mind intends them to be conformable and exactly to answer. These being such collections of simple ideas that the mind itself puts together, and such collections that each of them contains in it precisely all that the mind intends that it should, they are archetypes and essences of modes that may exist, and so are designed only for and belong only to such modes as, when they do exist, have an exact conformity with those complex ideas. The ideas, therefore, of modes and relations cannot but be adequate. End of section 30. Recording by Ryan Bissett. Section number 30 of An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Book 2 by John Locke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Bissett. Chapter 32 of True and False Ideas. 1. Though truth and falsehood belong in propriety of speech only to propositions, yet ideas are oftentimes termed true or false. As what words are there that are not used with great latitude and with some deviation from their strict and proper significations? Though I think that when ideas themselves are termed true or false, there is still some secret or tacit proposition which is the foundation of that denomination, as we shall see if we examine the particular occasions wherein they come to be called true or false. In all which we shall find some kind of affirmation or negation, which is the reason of that denomination. For our ideas, being nothing but bare appearances or perceptions in our minds, cannot properly and simply in themselves be said to be true or false. No more than a single name of any thing can be said to be true or false. 2. Indeed, both ideas and words may be said to be true in a metaphysical sense of the word truth, as all other things that any way exist are said to be true, i.e., really to be such as they exist. Though in things called true, even in that sense, there is perhaps a secret reference to our ideas, looked upon as the standards of that truth, which amounts to a mental proposition, though it be usually not taken notice of. 3. But it is not in that metaphysical sense of truth which we inquire here, when we examine whether our ideas are capable of being true or false, but in the more ordinary acceptation of those words. And so I say that the ideas in our minds being only so many perceptions or appearances there, none of them are false. The idea of a centaur having no more falsehood in it when it appears in our minds than the name centaur has falsehood in it when it is pronounced by our mouths or written on paper. For truth or falsehood lying always in some affirmation or negation, mental or verbal, our ideas are not capable, any of them, of being false till the mind passes some judgment on them, that is, affirms or denies something of them. 4. Whenever the mind refers any of its ideas to anything extraneous to them, they are then capable to be called true or false. Because the mind in such a reference makes a tacit supposition of their conformity to that thing, which supposition as it happens to be true or false, so the ideas themselves come to be denominated. The most usual cases wherein this happens are these following. 5. First, when the mind supposes any idea, it has conformable to that in other men's minds, called by the same common name, v.g. when the mind intends or judges its ideas of justice, temperance, religion, to be the same with that other men give those names to. Secondly, when the mind supposes any idea it has in itself to be conformable to some real existence. Thus the two ideas of a man and a centaur, supposed to be the ideas of real substances, are the one true and the other false, the one having a conformity to what has really existed, the other not. Thirdly, when the mind refers any of its ideas to that real constitution and essence of any thing whereon all its properties depend, and thus the greatest part, if not all our ideas of substances, are false. 6. These suppositions the mind is very apt tacitly to make concerning its own ideas, but yet, if we will examine it, we shall find it is chiefly, if not only, concerning its abstract complex ideas. For the natural tendency of the mind being towards knowledge, and finding that if it should proceed by and dwell upon only particular things, its progress would be very slow, and its work endless. Therefore, to shorten its way to knowledge, and make each perception more comprehensive, the first thing it does, as the foundation of the easier enlarging its knowledge, either by contemplation of the things themselves that it would know, or conference with others about them, is to bind them into bundles, and rank them so into sorts that what knowledge it gets of any of them it may thereby with assurance extend to all of that sort, and so advance by larger steps in that, which is its great business, knowledge. This, as I have elsewhere shown, is the reason why we collect things under comprehensive ideas, with names annexed to them, into genera and species, i.e., into kinds and sorts. 7. If, therefore, we will warily attend to the motions of the mind and observe what course it usually takes in its way to knowledge, we shall, I think, find that the mind having got an idea which it thinks it may have use of, either in contemplation or discourse, the first thing it does is to abstract it and then get a name to it, and so lay it up in its storehouse, the memory as containing the essence of a sort of things, of which that name is always to be the mark. Hence it is that we may often observe that when any one sees a new thing of a kind that he knows not, he presently asks what it is, meaning by that inquiry nothing but the name, as if the name carried with it the knowledge of the species or the essence of it, whereof it is indeed used as the mark and is generally supposed annexed to it. 8. But this abstract idea being something in the mind between the thing that exists and the name that is given to it, it is in our ideas that both the rightness of our knowledge and the propriety or intelligibleness of our speaking consists. And hence it is that men are so forward to suppose that the abstract ideas they have in their minds are such as agree to the things existing without them to which they are referred, and are the same also to which the names they give them do by the use and propriety of that language belong. For without this double conformity of their ideas, they find they should both think amiss of things in themselves and talk of them unintelligibly to others. 9. First then I say that when the truth of our ideas is judged of by the conformity they have to the ideas which other men have, and commonly signified by the same name, they may be by any of them false. But yet simple ideas are least of all liable to be so mistaken, because a man by his senses and every day's observation may easily satisfy himself what the simple ideas are, which their several names that are in common use stand for. They being but few in number, and such as if he doubts or mistakes in, he may easily rectify by the objects they are to be found in. Therefore it is seldom that anyone mistakes in his names of simple ideas, or applies the name red to the idea green, or the name sweet to the idea bitter. Much less are men apt to confound the names of ideas belonging to different senses, and call a color by the name of a taste, etc., whereby it is evident that the simple ideas they call by any name are commonly the same that others have and mean when they use the same names. 10. Complex ideas are much more liable to be false in this respect, and the complex ideas of mixed modes much more than those of substances. Because in substances, especially those which the common and unborrowed names of any language are applied to, some remarkable sensible qualities, serving ordinarily to distinguish one sort from another, easily preserve those who take any care in the use of their words from applying them to sorts of substances to which they do not at all belong. But in mixed modes we are much more uncertain, it being not so easy to determine of several actions whether they are to be called justice or cruelty, liberality or prodigality. And so, in referring our ideas to those of other men, called by the same names, ours may be false, and the idea in our minds, which we express by the word justice, may perhaps be that which ought to have another name. 11. But whether or no our ideas of mixed modes are more liable than any sort to be different than those of other men, which are marked by the same names, this at least is certain, that this sort of falsehood is much more familiarly attributed to our ideas of mixed modes than to any other. When a man is thought to have a false idea of justice, or gratitude, or glory, it is for no other reason but that his agrees not with the ideas which each of those names are the signs of in other men. 12. The reason whereof seems to me to be this, that the abstract ideas of mixed modes, being men's voluntary combinations of such a precise collection of simple ideas, and so the essence of each species being made by men alone, whereof we have no other sensible standard existing anywhere but the name itself, or the definition of that name. We have nothing else to refer these our ideas of mixed modes to, as a standard to which we would conform them, but the ideas of those who are thought to use those names in their most proper significations. And so, as our ideas conform or differ from them, they pass for true or false, and thus much concerning the truth and falsehood of our ideas in reference to their names. 13. Secondly, as to the truth and falsehood of our ideas in reference to the real existence of things, when that is made the standard of their truth, none of them can be termed false, but only our complex ideas of substances. 14. First, our simple ideas being barely such perceptions as God has fitted us to receive, and given power and external objects to produce in us by established laws and ways suitable to his wisdom and goodness, though incomprehensible to us, their truth consists in nothing else but in such appearances as are produced in us, and must be suitable to those powers he has placed in external objects, or else they could not be produced in us. And thus answering those powers, they are what they should be, true ideas. Nor do they become liable to any imputation of falsehood, if the mind, as in most men I believe it does, judges these ideas to be in the things themselves. For God, in his wisdom, having set them as marks of distinction in things, whereby we may be able to discern one thing from another, and so choose any of them for our uses as we have occasion, it alters not the nature of our simple idea, whether we think that the idea of blue be in the violet itself or in our mind only, and only the power of producing it by the texture of its parts reflecting the particles of light after a certain manner to be in the violet itself. For that texture in the object by a regular and constant operation, producing the same idea of blue in us, it serves us to distinguish by our eyes that from any other thing, whether that distinguishing mark, as it is really in the violet, be only a peculiar texture of parts, or else that very color, the idea whereof, which is in us, is the exact resemblance. And it is equally from that appearance to be denominated blue, whether it be that real color or only a peculiar texture in it that causes in us that idea. since the name blue notes properly nothing but that mark of distinction that is in a violet discernible only by our eyes, whatever it consists in, that being beyond our capacities distinctly to know, and perhaps would be of less use to us if we had faculties to discern. 15. Neither would it carry any imputation of falsehood to our simple ideas if by the different structure of our organs it were so ordered that the same objects should produce in several men's minds different ideas at the same time. V.g., if the idea that a violet produced in one man's mind by his eyes were the same that a marigold produced in another man's, and vice versa. For since this could never be known because one man's mind could not pass into another man's body to perceive what appearances were produced by those organs, neither the ideas hereby nor the names would be at all confounded, or any falsehood be in either. For all things that had the texture of a violet, producing constantly the idea that he called blue, and those which had the texture of a marigold, producing constantly the idea which he as constantly called yellow, whatever those appearances were in his mind, he would be able as regularly to distinguish things for his use by those appearances, and understand and signify those distinctions marked by the names blue and yellow, as if the appearances or ideas in his mind received from those two flowers were exactly the same with the ideas in other men's minds. I am, nevertheless, very apt to think that the sensible ideas produced by any object in different men's minds are most commonly very near and undiscernibly alike, for which opinion I think there might be many reasons offered, but that being besides my present business, I shall not trouble my reader with them, but only mind him that the contrary supposition, if it could be proved, is of little use, either for the improvement of our knowledge or conveniency of life, and so we need not trouble ourselves to examine it. 16. From what has been said concerning our simple ideas, I think it evident that our simple ideas can none of them be false in respect of things existing without us. For the truth of these appearances or perceptions in our minds consisting, as has been said, only in their being answerable to the powers and external objects to produce by our senses such appearances in us, and each of them being in the mind, such as it is, suitable to the power that produced it, and which alone it represents, it cannot upon that account, or as referred to such a pattern, be false. Blue and yellow, bitter or sweet, can never be false ideas. These perceptions in the mind are just as they are there, answering the powers appointed by God to produce them, and so are truly what they are and are intended to be. Indeed, the names may be misapplied, but that in this respect makes no falsehood in the ideas, as if a man ignorant in the English tongue should call purple scarlet. 17. Secondly, neither can our complex ideas of modes, in reference to the essence of anything really existing, be false. Because whatever complex idea I have of any mode, it hath no reference to any pattern existing, and made by nature. It is not supposed to contain in it any other ideas than what it hath, nor to represent anything but such a complication of ideas as it does. Thus when I have the idea of such an action of a man who forbears to afford himself such meat, drink, and clothing, and other conveniences of life, as his riches and estate will be sufficient to supply, and his station requires, I have no false idea, but such an one as represents an action, either as I find or imagine it, and so is capable of neither truth or falsehood. But when I give the name frugality or virtue to this action, then it may be called a false idea, if thereby it be supposed to agree with that idea to which, in propriety of speech, the name of frugality doth belong, or to be conformable to that law which is the standard of virtue and vice. 18. Thirdly, our complex ideas of substances, being all referred to patterns in things themselves, may be false. That they are all false when looked upon as the representations of the unknown essences of things is evident, that there needs nothing to be said of it. I shall therefore pass over that chimerical supposition and consider them as collections of simple ideas in the mind taken from combinations of simple ideas existing together constantly in things, of which patterns they are the supposed copies. And in this reference of them to the existence of things, they are false ideas. 1. When they put together simple ideas, which in the real existence of things have no union, as when to the shape and size that exist together in a horse is joined, in the same complex idea the power of barking like a dog, which three ideas, however put together into one in the mind, were never united in nature, and this therefore may be called a false idea of an horse. 2. Ideas of substances are, in this respect, also false. When from any collection of simple ideas that do always exist together, there is separated by a direct negation any other simple idea which is constantly joined with them. Thus, if to extension, solidity, fusibility, the peculiar weightiness, and yellow color of gold, anyone join in his thoughts the negation of a greater degree of fixedness than is in lead or copper, he may be said to have a false complex idea, as well as when he joins to those other simple ones the idea of a perfect absolute fixedness. For either way, the complex idea of gold being made up of such simple ones as have no union in nature may be termed false. But, if we leave out of this his complex idea, that of fixedness quite, without either actually joining to or separating of it from the rest in his mind, it is, I think, to be looked on as an inadequate and imperfect idea rather than a false one, since though it contains not all the simple ideas that are united in nature, yet it puts none together but what do really exist together. 19. Though, in compliance with the ordinary way of speaking, I have showed in what sense and upon what ground our ideas may be sometimes called true or false, yet if we will look a little nearer into the matter, in all cases where any idea is called true or false, it is from some judgment that the mind makes, or is supposed to make, that is true or false. For truth or falsehood being never without some affirmation or negation, express or tacit, it is not to be found but where signs are joined and separated according to the agreement or disagreement of the things they stand for. The signs we chiefly use are either ideas or words, wherewith we make either mental or verbal propositions. Truth lies in so joining or separating these representatives as the things they stand for do in themselves agree or disagree, and falsehood in the contrary, as shall be more fully shown hereafter. 20. Any idea, then, which we have in our minds, whether conformable or not to the existence of things, or to any idea in the minds of other men, cannot properly for this alone be called false. For these representations, if they have nothing in them, but what is really existing in things without, cannot be thought false, being exact representations of something. Nor yet, if they have anything in them differing from the reality of things, can they properly be said to be false representations or ideas of things they do not represent. But the mistake in falsehood is 21. First, when the mind having any idea, it judges and concludes it is the same that is in other men's minds, signified by the same name, or that it is conformable to the ordinary received signification or definition of that word, when indeed it is not, which is the most usual mistake in mixed modes, though other ideas also to it. 22. Secondly, when it having a complex idea made up of such a collection of simple ones as nature never puts together, it judges it to agree to a species of creatures really existing, as when it joins the weight of tin to the color, fusibility, and fixedness of gold. 23. Thirdly, when in its complex idea it has united a certain number of simple ideas that do really exist together in some sort of creatures, but has also left out others as much inseparable, it judges this to be a perfect, complete idea of a sort of things which really it is not, v.g., having joined the ideas of substance, yellow, malleable, most heavy, and fusible, it takes that complex idea to be the complete idea of gold, when yet its peculiar fixedness and solubility in aqua regia are as inseparable from those other ideas or qualities of that body as they are from one another. 24. Fourthly, the mistake is yet greater when I judge that this complex idea contains in it the real essence of any body existing, when at least it contains but some few of those properties which flow from its real essence and constitution. I say only some few of those properties, for those properties consisting mostly in the active and passive powers it has, in reference to other things, all that are vulgarly known of any one body of which the complex idea of that kind of things is usually made, are but a very few, in comparison of what a man, that has several ways tried and examined it, knows of that one sort of things. And all that the most expert man knows are but a few in comparison of what are really in that body and depend on its internal or essential constitution. The essence of a triangle lies in a very little compass, consists in a very few ideas. 3 lines, including a space, make up that essence. But the properties that flow from this essence are more than can be easily known or enumerated. So, I imagine it is in substances. Their real essence lie in a little compass, though the properties flowing from that internal constitution are endless. 25. To conclude, a man having no notion of anything without him, but by the idea he has of it in his mind, which idea he has the power to call by what name he pleases, he may indeed make an idea neither answering the reason of things, nor agreeing to the idea commonly signified by other people's words, but cannot make a wrong or false idea of a thing, which is no otherwise known to him but by the idea he has of it. V.G. When I frame an idea of the legs, arms, and body of a man, and join to this a horse's head and neck, I do not make a false idea of anything, because it represents nothing without me. But when I call it a man or Tartar, and imagine it to represent some real being without me, or to be the same idea that others call by the same name, in either of these cases I may err. And upon this account it is that it comes to be termed a false idea, though indeed the falsehood lies not in the idea, but in that tacit mental proposition, wherein a conformity and resemblance is attributed to it which it has not. But yet, if having framed such an idea in my mind, without thinking either that existence or the name man or Tartar belongs to it, I will call it man or Tartar. I may be justly thought fantastical in the naming, but not erroneous in my judgment, nor the idea any way false. 26. Upon the whole matter, I think that our ideas, as they are considered by the mind, either in reference to the proper signification of their names, or in reference to the reality of things, may very fitly be called right or wrong ideas, according as they agree or disagree to those patterns to which they are referred. But if anyone had rather call them true or false, it is fit he uses a liberty which everyone has to call things by those names he thinks best, though, in propriety of speech, truth or falsehood will, I think, scarce agree to them, but as they, some way or other, virtually contain in them some mental proposition. The ideas that are in a man's mind, simply considered, cannot be wrong unless complex ones wherein inconsistent parts are jumbled together. All other ideas are in themselves right, and the knowledge about them right and true knowledge. But when we come to refer them to any thing as to their patterns and archetypes, then they are capable of being wrong, as far as they disagree with such archetypes. End of section 31. Recording by Ryan Bissett.
Section 32 of an Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Book 2 by John Locke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner. Chapter 33 of the Association of Ideas. Section 1. There is scarce anyone that does not observe something that seems odd to him, and is in itself really extravagant in the opinions, reasonings, and actions of other men. The least flaw of this kind, if at all different from his own, every one is quick-sighted enough to espy in another, and will, by the authority of reason, forwardly condemn, though he be guilty of much greater unreasonableness in his own tenets and conduct, which he never perceives, and will very hardly, if at all, be convinced of. Section 2. This proceeds not wholly from self-love, though that has often a great hand in it. Men of fair minds, and not given up to overweening of self-flattery, are frequently guilty of it, and in many cases one with amazement hears the arguings, and is astonished at the obstinacy of a worthy man, who yields not to the evidence of reason, though laid before him as clear as daylight. Section 3. This sort of unreasonableness is usually imputed to education and prejudice, and for the most part truly enough, though that reaches not the bottom of the disease, nor shows distinctly enough whence it rises or wherein it lies. Education is often rightly assigned for the cause, and prejudice is a good general name for the thing itself. But yet, I think he ought to look a little farther who would trace this sort of madness to the root it springs from, and so explain it, as to show whence this flaw has its original in very sombre and rational minds, and wherein it consists. Section 4. I shall be pardoned for calling it by so harsh a name as madness, when it is considered that opposition to reason deserves that name, and is really madness, and there is scarce a man so free from it, but that if he should always, on all occasions, argue or do as in some cases he constantly does, would not be thought fitter for Bedlam than civil conversation. I do not here mean when he is under the power of any unruly passion, but in the steady calm course of his life. That which will yet more apologize for this harsh name and ungrateful imputation on the greatest part of mankind is, that inquiring a little by the by into the nature of madness, E2 C6 section 13, I find it to spring from the very same root, and to depend on the very same cause we are here speaking of. This consideration of the thing itself, at a time when I thought not the least on the subject which I am now treating of, suggests it to me. And if this be a weakness to which all men are so liable, if this be a taint which so universally infects mankind, the greater care should be taken to lay it open under its due name, thereby to excite the greater care in its prevention and cure. Section 5. Some of our ideas have a natural correspondence and connection one with another. It is the office and excellency of our reason to trace these and hold them together in that union and correspondence which is founded in their peculiar beings. Besides this, there is another connection of ideas, wholly owing to chance or custom. Ideas that in themselves are not all of kin come to be so united in some men's minds that it is very hard to separate them. They always keep in company, and the one no sooner at any time comes into the understanding, but its associate appears with it. And if they are more than two which are thus united, the whole gang, always inseparable, show themselves together. Section 6. This strong combination of ideas, not allied by nature, the mind makes in itself either voluntarily or by chance, and hence it comes in different men to be very different, according to their different inclinations, education, interests, etc. Custom settles habits of thinking in the understanding, as well as of determining in the will, and of motions in the body, all which seems to be but trains of motion in the animal spirits, which once set a-going, continue in the same steps they have been used to, which, by often trending, are worn into a smooth path, and the motion in it becomes easy, and as it were natural. As far as we can comprehend thinking, thus ideas seem to be produced in our minds, or if they are not, this may serve to explain their following one another in an habitual train, when once they are put into their track, as well as it does to explain such motions of the body. A musician used to any tune will find that let it but once begin in his head, the ideas of the several notes of it will follow one another orderly in his understanding, without any care or attention, as regularly as his fingers move orderly over the keys of the organ to play out the tune he has begun, though his unattentive thoughts be elsewhere a-wandering. Whether the natural cause of these ideas, as well as of that regular dancing of his fingers, be the motion of his animal spirits, I will not determine, how probable soever by this instance it appears to be so, but this may help us a little to conceive of intellectual habits and of the tying together of ideas. Section 7. That there are such associations of them made by custom in the minds of most men, I think nobody will question, who has well considered himself or others, and to this, perhaps, might be justly attributed most of the sympathies and antipathies observable in men, which work as strongly and produce as regular effects as if they were natural, and are therefore called so, though they at first had no other original but the accidental connection of two ideas, which either the strength of the first impression or future indulgence so united that they always afterwards keep company together in that man's mind, as if they were but one idea. I say most of the antipathies, I do not say all, for some of them are truly natural, depend upon our original constitution, and are born with us, but a great part of those which are counted natural would have been known to be from unheeded, though perhaps early impressions, or wanton fancies at first, which would have been acknowledged the original of them if they had been warily observed. A grown person surfeiting with honey no sooner hears the name of it, but his fancy immediately carries sickness and qualms to his stomach, and he cannot bear the very idea of it. Other ideas of dislike and sickness and vomiting presently accompanying it, and he is disturbed, but he knows from whence to date this weakness, and can tell how he got this indisposition. Had this happened to him by an overdose of honey when a child, all the same effects would have followed, but the cause would have been mistaken and the antipathy counted natural. Section 8. I mention this not out of any great necessity there is, in this present argument, to distinguish nicely between natural and acquired antipathies, but I take notice of it for another purpose, namely, that those who have children, or the charge of their education, would think it worth their while diligently to watch and carefully to prevent the undue connection of ideas in the minds of young people. This is the time most susceptible of lasting impressions, and though those relating to the health of the body are by discreet people minded and fenced against, yet I am apt to doubt that those which relate more peculiarly to the mind, and terminate in the understanding or passions, have been much less heeded than the thing deserves. Nay, those relating purely to the understanding have, as I suspect, been by most men wholly overlooked. Section 9. This wrong connection in our minds of ideas in themselves, loose and independent of one another, has such an influence, and is of so great force to set us awry in our actions, as well moral as natural, passions, reasonings, and notions themselves, that perhaps there is not any one thing that deserves more to be looked after. Section 10. The ideas of goblins and sprites have really no more to do with darkness than light, yet let but a foolish maid inculcate these often on the mind of a child, and raise them there together, possibly he shall never be able to separate them again so long as he lives, but darkness shall ever afterwards bring with it those frightful ideas, and they shall be so joined that he can no more bear the one than the other. Section 11. A man receives a sensible injury from another, thinks on the man and that action over and over, and by ruminating on them strongly or much in his mind, so cements those two ideas together that he makes them almost one, never thinks on the man, but the pain and displeasure he suffered comes into his mind with it, so that he scarce distinguishes them, but has as much an aversion for the one as the other. Thus hatreds are often begotten from slight and innocent occasions, and quarrels propagated and continued in the world. Section 12. A man has suffered pain or sickness in any place. He saw his friend die in such a room, though these have in nature nothing to do with one another. Yet, when the idea of the place occurs to his mind, it brings, the impression being once made, that of the pain and displeasure with it. He confounds them in his mind, and can as little bear the one as the other. Section 13. When this combination is settled, and while it lasts, it is not in the power of reason to help us and relieve us from the effects of it. Ideas in our minds, when they are there, will operate according to their natures and circumstances. And here we see the cause why time cures certain affections, which reason, though in the right and allowed to be so, has not power over, nor is able against them to prevail with those who are apt to hearken to it in other cases. The death of a child that was the daily delight of his mother's eyes and joy of her soul rends from her heart the whole comfort of her life, and gives her all the torment imaginable. Use the consolations of reason in this case, and you were as good preach ease to one on the rack, and hope to allay by rational discourses the pain of his joints tearing asunder, till time has by disuse separated the sense of that enjoyment and its loss from the idea of the child, returning to her memory. All representations, though ever so reasonable, are in vain, and therefore some in whom the union between these ideas is never dissolved spend their lives in mourning, and carry an incurable sorrow to their graves. Section 14. A friend of mine knew one perfectly cured of madness by a very harsh and offensive operation. The gentleman, who was thus recovered with great sense of gratitude and acknowledgment, owned the cure all his life after, as the greatest obligation he could have received. But whatever gratitude and reason suggested to him, he could never bear the sight of the operator. That image brought back with it the idea of that agony which he suffered from his hands, which was too mighty and intolerable for him to endure. Section 15. Many children, imputing the pain they endured at school to their books they were corrected for, so join those ideas together that a book becomes their aversion, and they are never reconciled to the study and use of them all their lives after, and thus reading becomes a torment to them, which otherwise possibly they might have made the great pleasure of their lives. There are rooms convenient enough that some men cannot study in, and fashions of vessels which, though ever so clean and commodious, they cannot drink out of, and that by reason of some accidental ideas which are annexed to them, and make them offensive. And who is there that hath not observed some man to flag at the appearance or in the company of some certain person not otherwise superior to him, but because, having once on some occasion got the ascendant, the idea of authority and distance goes along with that of the person, and he that has been thus subjected is not able to separate them. Section 16. Instances of this kind are so plentiful everywhere that if I add one more, it is only for the pleasant oddness of it. It is of a young gentleman who, having learnt to dance, and that to great perfection, there happened to stand an old trunk in the room where he learnt. The idea of this remarkable piece of household stuff had so mixed itself with the turns and steps of all his dances, that though in that chamber he could dance excellently well, yet it was only whilst that trunk was there, nor could he perform well in any other place, unless that or some such other trunk had its due position in the room. If this story shall be suspected to be dressed up with some comical circumstances a little beyond precise nature, I answer for myself that I had it some years since from a very sombre and worthy man upon his own knowledge, as I report it. And I dare say there are very few inquisitive persons who read this who have not met with accounts, if not examples of this nature, that may parallel or at least justify this. Section 17. Intellectual habits and defects this way contracted are not less frequent and powerful, though less observed. Let the ideas of being and matter be strongly joined, either by education or much thought, whilst these are still combined in the mind. What notions, what reasonings will there be about separate spirits? Let custom from the very childhood have joined figure and shape to the idea of God, and what absurdities will that mind be liable to about the deity? Let the idea of infallibility be inseparably joined to any person, and these two constantly together possess the mind. And then one body, in two places at once, shall, unexamined, be swallowed for a certain truth by an implicit faith, whenever that imagined infallible person dictates and demands assent without inquiry. Section 18. Some such wrong and unnatural combinations of ideas will be found to establish the irreconcilable opposition between different sects of philosophy and religion. For we cannot imagine every one of their followers to impose wilfully on himself, and knowingly refuse truth offered by plain reason. Interest, though it does a great deal in the case, yet cannot be thought to work whole societies of men to so universal a perverseness as that every one of them to a man should knowingly maintain falsehood. Some at least must be allowed to do what all pretend to, i.e. to pursue truth sincerely, and therefore there must be something that blinds their understandings and makes them not see the falsehood of what they embrace for real truth. That which thus captivates their reasons and leads men of sincerity blindfold from common sense will, when examined, be found to be what we are speaking of. Some independent ideas of no alliance to one another are by education, custom, and the constant din of their party so coupled in their minds that they always appear there together, and they can no more separate them in their thoughts than if there were but one idea, and they operate as if they were so. This gives sense to jargon, demonstration to absurdities, and consistencies to nonsense, and is the foundation of the greatest, I had almost said, of all the errors in the world. Or if it does not reach so far, it is at least the most dangerous one, since, so far as it obtains, it hinders men from seeing and examining. When two things in themselves disjoined appear to the sight constantly united, if the eye sees these things riveted, which are loose, where will you begin to rectify the mistakes that follow in two ideas, that they have been accustomed so to join in their minds as to substitute one for the other, and, as I am apt to think, often without perceiving it themselves? This, whilst they are under the deceit of it, makes them incapable of conviction, and they applaud themselves as zealous champions for truth, when indeed they are contending for error, and the confusion of two different ideas, which a customary connection of them in their minds hath to them made in effect but one, fills their heads with false views and their reasonings with false consequences. Section 19. Having thus given an account of the original sorts and extent of our ideas, with several other considerations about these, I know not whether I may say, instruments or materials of our knowledge, the method I at first proposed to myself would now require that I should immediately proceed to show what use the understanding makes of them, and what knowledge we have by them. This was that which, in the first general view I had of this subject, was all that I thought I should have to do. But upon a nearer approach I find that there is so close a connection between ideas and words, that our abstract ideas and general words have so constant a relation one to another that it is impossible to speak clearly and distinctly of our knowledge, which all consists in propositions, without considering first the nature, use, and signification of language, which therefore must be the business of the next book. End of section 32. Recording by Chad Horner. End of an essay concerning human understanding, Book 2 by John Locke.